When he arrived in New York on the evening of Christmas Day, he found a letter from his daughter. Answering her next day, he told her, "I wanted it much, for I had a frightful cold. English colds are nothing to those of this country, and was very miserable. It is a bad country to be unwell and traveling in. You are one of, say, 100 people in a heated car with a great stove in it, all the little windows being closed, and the bumping and banging about are indescribable, the atmosphere detestable, the ordinary motion all but intolerable." The following day this addition was made to the letter. "I managed to read last night, but it was as much as I could do. Today I am so very unwell that I have sent for a doctor. He has just been, and is in doubt whether I shall not have to stop reading for a while." His stronger will prevailed, and he went on without stopping. On the last day of the year, he announced to us that though he had been very low, he was getting right again, that in a couple of days he should have accomplished a fourth of the entire readings, and that the first month of the new year would see him through Philadelphia and Baltimore, as well as through 2 more nights in Boston. He also prepared his English friends for the startling intelligence they might shortly expect of 4 readings coming off in a church, before an audience of 2,000 people accommodated in pews, and with himself emerging from a vestry. Chapter 16. America Revisited, January to April 1868. Speculators and the public Republican self-help receipts, affected by speculators again, at Boston hit of Marigold, and of Boots at Holly Tree Chapel readings, at Brooklyn Energy of New York speculators at Philadelphia Irish Element, in New York improved social ways result of third of 4 reading shadow to the Sunshine arrangements for Washington at Baltimore success, in Philadelphia value, of a vote objections to colored people at Washington with Sumner, and Stanton Lincoln's last Cabinet Council Lincoln's dream interview with President Johnson incident at first. Reading 1 of the audience a day at the reading's proposed walking match in his hotel, at Philadelphia Providence, and New Haven Northwest to President's impeachment political excitement Boston audiences struggle for tickets in remote places at Rochester at Syracuse and Buffalo American. Female Beauty Suspension, Bridge at Niagara final impression of the Falls at Utica reading at Albany, New England engagements again. Attacked by lameness reading at New Bedford nearly used up farewell readings last Boston readings New York, farewells receipts throughout public dinner to Dickens. The reading on the 3rd of January closed a fourth of the entire series, and on that day Dickens wrote of the trouble brought on them by the speculators, which to some extent had affected unfavorably the 3 previous nights in New York. When adventurers buy up the best places, the public resent it by refusing the worst, to prevent it by first helping themselves, being the last thing they ever think of doing. We try to withhold the best seats from the speculators, but the unaccountable thing is that the great mass of the public buy of them prefer it, and the rest of the public are injured if we have not got those very seats to sell them. We have now a traveling staff of 6 men, in spite of which Dolby, who is leaving me today to sell tickets in Philadelphia tomorrow morning, will no doubt get into a tempest of difficulties. Of course also, in such a matter, as many obstacles as possible are thrown in an Englishman's way, and he may himself be a little injudicious into the bargain. Last night, for instance, he met one of the ushers who show people to their seats coming in with one of our men. It is against orders that anyone employed in front should go out during the reading, and he took this man to task in the British manner. Instantly, the free and independent usher put on his hat and walked off. Seeing which, all the other free and independent ushers, some 20 in number, put on their hats and walked off, leaving us absolutely devoid and destitute of a staff for tonight. One has since been improvised, but it was a small matter to raise a stir and ill will about, especially as one of our men was equally in fault, and really there is little to be done at night. American people are so accustomed to take care of themselves that one of these immense audiences will fall into their places with an ease amazing to a frequenter of St. James's Hall. And the certainty with which they are all in, before I go on, is a very acceptable mark of respect. Our great labor is outside, and we have been obliged to bring our staff up to 6, besides a boy or 2, by employment of a regular additional clerk, a Bostonian. The speculators buying the front seats, we have found instances of this being done by merchants in good position. The public will not have the back seats, return their tickets, write and print volumes on the subject, and deter others from coming. You are not to suppose that this prevails to any great extent, as our lowest house here has been 300, but it does hit us. There is no doubt about it. Fortunately, I saw the danger when the trouble began, and change the list at the right time. You may get an idea of the staff's work by what is in hand now. They are preparing, numbering, and stamping 6,000 tickets for Philadelphia and 8,000 tickets for Brooklyn. The moment those are done, another 8,000 tickets will be wanted for Baltimore, and probably another 6,000 for Washington. And all this in addition to the correspondence, advertisements, accounts, traveling, and the nightly business of the readings 4 times a week. I cannot get rid of this intolerable cold. My landlord invented for me a drink of brandy, rum, and snow, called it a Rocky Mountain sneezer, and said it was to put down all less effectual sneezing. But it has not yet had the effect. Did I tell you that the favorite drink before you get up is an eye-opener? There has been another fall of snow, succeeded by a heavy thaw. The day after the 4th, he went back to Boston, and next day wrote to me, I am to read here on Monday and Tuesday, return to New York on Wednesday, and finish there except the farewells in April on Thursday and Friday. The New York reading of Dr. Marigold made really a tremendous hit. The people doubted at first, having evidently not the least idea what could be done with it, and broke out at last into a perfect chorus of delight. At the end, they made a great shout and gave a rush towards the platform as if they were going to carry me off. It puts a strong additional arrow into my quiver. Another extraordinary success has been Nickleby and Boots at the Holly Tree, appreciated here in Boston. By the by, even more than Copperfield. And think of our last New York night bringing 500 English into the house, after making more than the necessary deduction for the present price of gold. The manager is always going about with an immense bundle that looks like a sofa cushion, but is in reality paper money, and it had risen to the proportions of a sofa on the morning he left for Philadelphia. Well, the work is hard, the climate is hard, the life is hard, but so far the gain is enormous. My cold steadily refuses to stir an inch. It distresses me greatly at times, though it is always good enough to leave me for the needful 2 hours. I have tried allopathy, homopathy, cold things, warm things, sweet things, bitter things, stimulants, narcotics, all with the same result. Nothing will touch it. In the same letter, light was thrown on the ecclesiastical mystery. At Brooklyn, I am going to read in Mr. Ward Beecher's chapel, the only building there available for the purpose. You must understand that Brooklyn is a kind of sleeping place for New York, and is supposed to be a great place in the money way. We let the seats pew by pew, the pulpit is taken down for my screen and gas, and I appear out of the vestry in canonical form. These ecclesiastical entertainments come off on the evenings of the 16th, 17th, 20th, and 21st of the present month. His first letter after returning to New York 9th of January made additions to the Brooklyn picture. Each evening, an enormous ferryboat will convey me and my state carriage, not to mention half a dozen wagons, and any number of people and a few score of horses across the river to Brooklyn, and will bring me back again. The sale of tickets there was an amazing scene. The noble army of speculators are now furnished, this is literally true, and I am quite serious, each man with a straw mattress, a little bag of bread and meat, 2 blankets, and a bottle of whiskey. With this outfit, they lie down in line on the pavement the whole of the night before the tickets are sold, generally taking up their position at about 10. It being severely cold at Brooklyn, they made an immense bonfire in the street, a narrow street of wooden house which the police turned out to extinguish. A general fight then took place, from which the people farthest off in the line rushed bleating when they saw any chance of ousting others nearer the door, put their mattresses in the spots so gained, and held on by the iron rails. At 8 in the morning, Dolby appeared with the tickets in a portmanteau. He was immediately saluted with a roar of halloa. Dolby, so Charlie has let you have the carriage, has he, Dolby? How is he, Dolby? Do not drop the tickets, Dolby. Look alive, Dolby. 100, 100, 100. In the midst of which he proceeded to business, and concluded as usual by giving universal dissatisfaction. He is now going off upon a little journey to look over the ground and cut back again. This little journey to Chicago is 1,200 miles on end, by railway besides the back again. It might tax the Englishman, but was nothing to the native American. It was part of his New York landlord's ordinary life in a week, Dickens told me, to go to Chicago and look at his theater there on a Monday, to pelt back to Boston and look at his theater there on a Thursday, and to come rushing to New York on a Friday to apostrophize his enormous ballet. 3 days later, still at New York, he wrote to his sister-in-law. I am off to Philadelphia this evening for the first of 3 visits of 2 nights each, tickets for all being sold. My cold steadily refuses to leave me, but otherwise I am as well as I can hope to be under this heavy work. My New York readings are over except the farewell nights, and I look forward to the relief of being out of my hardest haul. On Friday, I was again dead beat at the end, and was once more laid upon a sofa. But the faintness went off after a little while. We have now cold, bright, frosty weather, without snow, the best weather for me. Next day from Philadelphia, he wrote to his daughter that he was lodged in the Continental, one of the most immense of American hotels, but that he found himself just as quiet as elsewhere. Everything is very good, my waiter is German, and the greater part of the servants seem to be colored people. The town is very clean, and the day as blue and bright as a fine Italian day. But it freezes very, very hard, and my cold is not improved. For the cars were so intolerably hot that I was often obliged to stand upon the brake outside, and then the frosty air bit me indeed. I find it necessary, so oppressed am I with this American catarrh, as they call it, to dine at 3 o'clock instead of 4, that I may have more time to get voice, so that the days are cut short and letter writing not easy. He nevertheless found time in the city to write to me 14th of January, the most interesting mention he had yet made of such opinions as he had been able to form during his present visit, apart from the pursuit that absorbed him. Of such of those opinions as were given on a former page, it is only necessary to repeat that, while the tone of party politics still impressed him unfavorably, he had thus far seen everywhere great changes for the better socially. I will add other points from the same letter. That he was unfortunate in his time of visiting New York, as far as its politics were concerned, what has since happened conclusively shows. The Irish element is acquiring such enormous influence in New York City that when I think of it and see the large Roman Catholic cathedral rising there, it seems unfair to stigmatize as American other monstrous things that one also sees. But the general corruption in respect of the local funds appears to be stupendous, and there is an alarming thing as to some of the courts of law which I am afraid is Nate of Eborn. A case came under my notice the other day in which it was perfectly plain, from what was said to me by a person interested in resisting an injunction, that his first proceeding had been to look up the judge. Of such occasional provincial oddity, harmless in itself but strange in large cities, as he noticed in the sort of half disappointment at the small fuss made by himself about the readings, and in the newspaper references to Mr. Dickens's extraordinary composure on the platform, he gives an illustration. Last night here in Philadelphia, my first night, a very impressible and responsive audience were so astounded by my simply walking in and opening my book that I wondered what was the matter. They evidently thought that there ought to have been a flourish, and Dolby sent in to prepare for me. With them, it is the simplicity of the operation that raises wonder. With the newspapers, Mr. Dickens's extraordinary composure is not reasoned out as being necessary to the art of the thing, but is sensitively watched with a lurking doubt whether it may not imply disparagement of the audience. Both these things strike me as drolly expressive. His testimony as to improved social habits and ways was expressed very decidedly. I think it reasonable to expect that, as I go westward, I shall find the old manners going on before me, and may tread upon their skirts mayhap. But so far, I have had no more intrusion or boredom than I have when I lead the same life in England. I write this in an immense hotel, but I am as much at peace in my own rooms, and am left as wholly undisturbed, as if I were at the Station Hotel in York. I have now read in New York City to 40,000 people, and am quite as well known in the streets there as I am in London. People will turn back, turn again and face me, and have a look at me, or will say to one another, "Look here. Dickens coming," but no one ever stops me or addresses me. Sitting reading in the carriage outside the New York post office while one of the staff was stamping the letters inside, I became conscious that a few people who had been looking at the turnout had discovered me within. On my peeping out good-humoredly, one of them, I should say a merchant's bookkeeper, stepped up to the door, took off his hat, and said in a frank way, "Mr. Dickens, I should very much like to have the honor of shaking hands with you," and, that done, presented two others. Nothing could be more quiet or less intrusive. In the railway cars, if I see anybody who clearly wants to speak to me, I usually anticipate the wish by speaking myself. If I am standing on the brake outside to avoid the intolerable stove, people getting down will say with a smile, "As I am taking my departure, Mr. Dickens, and cannot trouble you for more than a moment, I should like to take you by the hand, sir." And so we shake hands and go our ways. Of course, many of my impressions come through the readings. Thus I find the people lighter and more humorous than formerly, and there must be a great deal of innocent imagination among every class, or they never could pet with such extraordinary pleasure as they do, the Boots story of the elopement of the two little children. They seem to see the children, and the women set up a shrill undercurrent of half pity and half pleasure that is quite affecting. Tonight's reading is my 26th, but as all the Philadelphia tickets for four more are sold, as well as four at Brooklyn, you must assume that I am at me 35th reading. I have remitted to Coutz's in English gold 10,000 odd, and I roughly calculate that on this number Dolby will have another £1,000 profit to pay me. These figures are of course between ourselves at present, but are they not magnificent? The expenses, always recollect, are enormous. On the other hand, we never have occasion to print a bill of any sort. Bill printing and posting are great charges at home, and have just now sold off 90 worth of bill paper, provided beforehand, as a wholly useless encumbrance. Then came, as ever, the constant shadow that still attended him, the slave in the chariot of his triumph. The work is very severe. There is now no chance of my being rid of this American catarrh until I embark for England. It is very distressing. It likewise happens, not seldom, that I am so dead beat when I come off that they lay me down on a sofa after I have been washed and dressed, and I lie there, extremely faint, for a quarter of an hour. In that time I rally and come right. 1 week later from New York, where he had become due on the 16th for the first of his four Brooklyn readings, he wrote to his sister-in-law, "My cold sticks to me, and I can scarcely exaggerate what I undergo from sleeplessness. I rarely take any breakfast but an egg and a cup of tea, not even toast or bread and butter. My small dinner at 3, and a little quail or some such light thing when I come home at night, is my daily fare, and at the hall I have established the custom of taking an egg beaten up in sherry before going in, and another between the parts, which I think pulls me up. It is snowing hard now, and I begin to move tomorrow. There is so much floating ice in the river that we are obliged to have a pretty wide margin of time for getting over the ferry to read." The last of the readings over the ferry was on the day when this letter was written. I finished at my church tonight. It is Mrs. Stowe's brother's, and a most wonderful place to speak in. We had it enormously full last night, Marigold and trial, but it scarcely required an effort. Mr. Ward Beecher being present in his pew, I sent to invite him to come round before he left. I found him to be an unostentatious, evidently able, straightforward, and agreeable man, extremely well informed, and with a good knowledge of art. Baltimore and Washington were the cities in which he was now, on quitting New York, to read for the first time, and as to the latter some doubts arose. The exceptional course had been taken in regard to it, of selecting a hall with space for not more than 700 and charging everybody $5, to which Dickens, at first greatly opposed, had yielded upon use of the argument, "You have more people at New York, thanks to the speculators, paying more than $5 every night." But now other suggestions came. Horace Greeley dined with me last Saturday. He wrote on the 20th, and did not like my going to Washington, now full of the greatest rowdies and worst kind of people in the States. Last night at 11 came B expressing like doubts, and though they may be absurd, I thought them worth attention. B. Coming so close on Greeley. Mr. Dolby was in consequence sent express to Washington with power to withdraw or go on, as inquiry on the spot might dictate. And Dickens took the additional resolve so far to modify the last arrangements of his tour as to avoid the distances of Chicago, St. Louis, and Cincinnati, to content himself with smaller places and profits, and thereby to get home nearly a month earlier. He was at Philadelphia on the 23rd of January, when he announced this intention. The worst of it is that everybody one advises with has a monomania respecting Chicago. "Good heavens, sir," the great Philadelphia authority said to me this morning, "if you do not read in Chicago, the people will go into fits." Well, I answered, I would rather they went into fits than I 999. But he did not seem to see it at all. From Baltimore he wrote to his sister-in-law on the 29th, in the hour's interval he had to spare before going back to Philadelphia. "It has been snowing hard for 24 hours, though this place is as far south as Valencia in Spain, and my manager, being on his way to New York, has a good chance of being snowed up somewhere. This is one of the places where Butler carried it with a high hand during the war, and where the ladies used to spit when they passed a northern soldier. They are very handsome women, with an Eastern touch in them, and dress brilliantly. I have rarely seen so many fine faces in an audience. They are bright, responsive people likewise, and very pleasant to read to. My hall is a charming little opera house built by a society of Germans, quite a delightful place for the purpose. I stand on the stage with the drop curtain down and my screen before it. The whole scene is very pretty and complete, and the audience have a ring in them that sounds deeper than the ear. I go from here to Philadelphia to read tomorrow night and Friday, come through here again on Saturday on my way back to Washington, come back here on Saturday week for 2 finishing nights, then go to Philadelphia for 2 farewell, so turn my back on the southern part of the country. Our new plan will give 82 readings in all. The real number was 76, 6 having been dropped on subsequent political excitements. Of course, I afterwards discovered that we had finally settled the list on a Friday. I shall be halfway through it at Washington, of course on a Friday also, and my birthday. To myself, he wrote on the following day from Philadelphia, beginning with a thank heaven that he had struck off Canada and the West, for he found the wear and tear enormous. Dolby decided that the Croakers were wrong about Washington, and went on, the rather as his raised prices, which he put finally at $3 each, gave satisfaction. Fields is so confident about Boston that my remaining list includes, in all, 14 more readings there. I do not know how many more we might not have had here where I have had attentions otherwise that have been very grateful to me if we had chosen. Tickets are now being resold at $10 each. At Baltimore, I had a charming little theater and a very apprehensive, impulsive audience. It is remarkable to see how the ghost of slavery haunts the town, and how the shambling, untidy, evasive, and postponing irrepressible proceeds about his free work, going round and round it instead of at it. The melancholy absurdity of giving these people votes, at any rate at present, would glare at one out of every roll of their eyes, chuckle in their mouths, and bump in their heads, if one did not see as one cannot help seeing in the country that their enfranchisement is a mere party trick to get votes. Being at the penitentiary the other day while we mentioned votes, and looking over the books, I noticed that almost every man had been pardoned a day or two before his time was up. Why? Because, if he had served his time out, he would have been ipso facto disfranchised. So this form of pardon is gone through to save his vote, and as every officer of the prison holds his place only in right of his party, of course his hopeful clients vote for the party that has let them out. When I read in Mr. Beecher's church at Brooklyn, we found the trustees had suppressed the fact that a certain upper gallery, holding 150, was the colored gallery. On the first night, not a soul could be induced to enter it. And it was not until it became known next day that I was certainly not going to read there more than 4 times that we managed to fill it. One night at New York, on our second or third row, there were 2 well-dressed women with a tinge of color, I should say, not even quadroons. But the holder of one ticket, who found his seat to be next them, demanded of Dolby what he meant by fixing him next to those 2 gourd-darned cusses of niggers, and insisted on being supplied with another good place. Dolby firmly replied that he was perfectly certain Mr. Dickens would not recognize such an objection on any account, but he could have his money back if he chose, which, after some squabbling, he had. In a comic scene in the New York circus one night, when I was looking on, 4 white people sat down upon a form in a barber's shop to be shaved. A colored man came as the 5th customer, and the 4 immediately ran away. This was much laughed at and applauded. In the Baltimore penitentiary, the white prisoners dine on one side of the room, the colored prisoners on the other, and no one has the slightest idea of mixing them. But it is indubitably the fact that exhalations not the most agreeable arise from a number of colored people got together, and I was obliged to beat a quick retreat from their dormitory. I strongly believe that they will die out of this country fast. It seems, looking at them, so manifestly absurd to suppose it possible that they can ever hold their own against a restless, shifty, striving, stronger race. On the 4th of February, he wrote from Washington, "You may like to have a line to let you know that it is all right here, and that the Croakers were simply ridiculous. I began last night. A charming audience, no dissatisfaction whatever at the raised prices, nothing missed or lost, cheers at the end of the carol, and rounds upon rounds of applause all through." All the foremost men and their families had taken tickets for the series of 4. A small place to read in. 300 in it. It will be no violation of the rule of avoiding private detail if the very interesting close of this letter is given. Its anecdote of President Lincoln was repeatedly told by Dickens after his return, and I am under no necessity to withhold from it the authority of Mr. Sumner's name. I am going tomorrow to see the President, who has sent to me twice. I dined with Charles Sumner last Sunday, against my rule, and as I had stipulated for no party, Mr. Secretary Stanton was the only other guest, besides his own secretary. Stanton is a man with a very remarkable memory and extraordinarily familiar with my books. he and Sumner having been the first two public men at the dying president's bedside, and having remained with him until he breathed his last, we fell into a very interesting conversation after dinner, when, each of them giving his own narrative separately, the usual discrepancies about details of time were observable. Then Mr. Stanton told me a curious little story, which will form the remainder of this short letter. On the afternoon of the day on which the president was shot, there was a cabinet council at which he presided. Mr. Stanton, being at the time commander-in-chief of the northern troops that were concentrated about here, arrived rather late. Indeed, they were waiting for him, and on his entering the room, the president broke off in something he was saying and remarked, "Let us proceed to business, gentlemen. Mr. Stanton then noticed, with great surprise, that the president sat with an air of dignity in his chair, instead of lolling about it in the most ungainly attitudes, as his invariable custom was, and that instead of telling irrelevant or questionable stories, he was grave and calm and quite a different man. Mr. Stanton, on leaving the council with the Attorney General, said to him, "That is the most satisfactory cabinet meeting I have attended for many a long day. What an extraordinary change in Mr. Lincoln." The Attorney General replied, "We all saw it before you came in. While we were waiting for you," he said, with his chin down on his breast, "gentlemen, something very extraordinary is going to happen, and that very soon." To which the Attorney General had observed, "Something good, sir, I hope?" When the President answered very gravely, "I do not know, I do not know. But it will happen, and shortly too." As they were all impressed by his manner, the Attorney General took him up again. "Have you received any information, sir, not yet disclosed to us?" "No," answered the President, "but I have had a dream. And I have now had the same dream 3 times. Once on the night preceding the Battle of Bull Run. Once on the night preceding such another, naming a battle also not favorable to the North." His chin sank on his breast again, and he sat reflecting. "Might one ask the nature of this dream, sir?" said the Attorney General. "Well," replied the president, without lifting his head or changing his attitude, "I am on a great broad rolling river, and I am in a boat, and I drift and I drift. But this is not business." Suddenly raising his face and looking round the table as Mr. Stanton entered, "Let us proceed to business, gentlemen." Mr. Stanton and the Attorney General said, as they walked on together, it would be curious to notice whether anything ensued on this, and they agreed to notice. He was shot that night. On his birthday, the 7th of February, Dickens had his interview with President Andrew Johnson. This scrambling scribblement is resumed this morning, because I have just seen the President, who had sent to me very courteously asking me to make my own appointment. He is a man with a remarkable face, indicating courage, watchfulness, and certainly strength of purpose. It is a face of the Webster type, but without the bounce of Webster's face. I would have picked him out anywhere as a character of mark. Figure, rather stoutish for an American, a trifle under the middle size, hands clasped in front of him, manner suppressed, guarded, anxious. Each of us looked at the other very hard. It was in his own cabinet that I saw him. As I came away, Thornton drove up in a sleigh turned out for a state occasion to deliver his credentials. There was to be a cabinet council at 12. The room was very like a London club's ante-drawing room. On the walls, 2 engravings only, one of his own portrait, one of Lincoln's. In the outer room was sitting a certain sunburnt General Blair, with many evidences of the war upon him. He got up to shake hands with me, and then I found that he had been out on the prairie with me 25 years ago. The papers having referred to my birthday's falling today, my room is filled with most exquisite flowers. They came pouring in from all sorts of people at breakfast time. The audiences here are really very fine, so ready to laugh or cry, and doing both so freely that you would suppose them to be Manchester shillings rather than Washington half-sovereigns. Alas, alas, my cold worse than ever. So he had written too at the opening of his letter. The first reading had been 4 days earlier, and was described to his daughter in a letter on the 4th, with a comical incident that occurred in the course of it. The gas was very defective indeed last night, and I began with a small speech to the effect that I must trust to the brightness of their faces for the illumination of mine. This was taken greatly. In the carol, a most ridiculous incident occurred. All of a sudden, I saw a dog leap out from among the seats in the center aisle and look very intently at me. The general attention being fixed on me, I do not think anybody saw this dog, but I felt so sure of his turning up again and barking that I kept my eye wandering about in search of him. He was a very comic dog, and it was well for me that I was reading a comic part of the book. But when he bounced out into the center aisle again, in an entirely new place, and still looking intently at me tried the effect of a bark upon my proceedings, I was seized with such a paroxysm of laughter that it communicated itself to the audience, and we roared at one another, loud and long. 3 days later, the sequel came, in a letter to his sister-in-law. I mentioned the dog on the first night here. Next night, I thought I heard in Copperfield a suddenly suppressed bark. It happened in this wise. One of our people, standing just within the door, felt his leg touched, and looking down beheld the dog, staring intently at me, and evidently just about to bark. In a transport of presence of mind and fury, he instantly caught him up in both hands, and threw him over his own head, out into the entry, where the check-takers received him like a game at ball. Last night he came again with another dog, but our people were so sharply on the lookout for him that he did not get in. He had evidently promised to pass the other dog free. What is expressed in these letters, of a still active, hopeful, enjoying, energetic spirit, able to assert itself against illness of the body and in some sort to overmaster it, was also so strongly impressed upon those who were with him, that, seeing his sufferings as they did, they yet found it difficult to understand the extent of them. The sadness thus ever underlying his triumph makes it all very tragical. That afternoon of my birthday, he wrote from Baltimore on the 11th, my catarrh was in such a state that Charles Sumner, coming in at 5 o'clock, and finding me covered with mustard poultice and apparently voiceless, turned to Dolby and said, "Surely, Mr. Dolby, it is impossible that he can read tonight." Says Dolby, "Sir, I have told Mr. Dickens so 4 times today, and I have been very anxious. But you have no idea how he will change when he gets to the little table." After 5 minutes of the little table, I was not for the time even hoarse. The frequent experience of this return of force when it is wanted saves me a vast amount of anxiety, but I am not at times without the nervous dread that I may some day sink altogether. To the same effect in another letter he adds, Dolby and Osgood, the latter represented the publishing firm of Mr. Fields and was one of the traveling staff, who do the most ridiculous things to keep me in spirits. I am often very heavy, and rarely sleep much, are determined to have a walking match at Boston on the last day of February to celebrate the arrival of the day when I can say next month, for home. The match ended in the Englishman's defeat, which Dickens doubly commemorated by a narrative of the American victory in sporting newspaper style, and by a dinner in Boston to a party of dear friends there. After Baltimore, he was reading again at Philadelphia, from which he wrote to his sister-in-law on the 13th, as to a characteristic trait observed in both places. Nothing will induce the people to believe in the farewells. At Baltimore on Tuesday night, a very brilliant night indeed, they asked as they came out, "When will Mr. Dickens read here again?" "Never, nonsense. Not come back after such houses as these? Come, say when he will read again, just the same here. We could as soon persuade them that I am the president, as that tomorrow night I am going to read here for the last time. There is a child in this house, a little girl to, whom I presented a black doll when I was here last. And as I have just seen her eye at the keyhole since I began writing this, I think she and the doll must be outside still. When you sent it up to me by the colored boy, she said after receiving it, colored boy is the term for black waiter, I gave such a cream that ma come running in and creamed too, 'cause she fort I would hurt myself. But I creamed a cream of joy. She had a friend to play with her that day, and brought the friend with her to my infinite confusion. A friend all stockings and much too tall, who sat on the sofa very far back with her stockings sticking stiffly out in front of her, and glared at me, and never spake a word. Dolby found us confronted in a sort of fascination, like serpent and bird. On the 15th he was again at New York, in the thick of more troubles with the speculators. They involved even charges of fraud in ticket sales at New Haven and Providence, indignation meetings having been held by the mayors, and unavailing attempts made by his manager to turn the wrath aside. I expect him back here presently half bereft of his senses, and I should be wholly bereft of mine if the situation were not comical as well as disagreeable. We can sell at our own box office to any extent, but we cannot buy back of the speculators, because we have informed the public that all the tickets are gone. And even if we made the sacrifice of buying at their price and selling at ours, we should be accused of treating with them and of making money by it. It ended in Providence by his going himself to the town and making a speech, and in New Haven it ended by his sending back the money taken, with intimation that he would not read until there had been a new distribution of the tickets approved by all the town. Fresh disturbance broke out upon this, but he stuck to his determination to delay the reading until the heats had cooled down, and what should have been given in the middle of February, he did not give until the close of March. The readings he had promised at the smaller outlying places by the Canadian frontier and Niagara district, including Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo, were appointed for that same March month, which was to be the interval between the close of the ordinary readings and the farewells in the two. leading cities. All that had been promised in New York were closed when he returned to Boston on the 23rd of February, ready for the increase he had promised there. But the check of a sudden political excitement came. It was the month when the vote was taken for impeachment of President Johnson. It is well 25th of February that the money has flowed in hitherto so fast, for I have a misgiving that the great excitement about the president's impeachment will damage our receipts. The vote was taken at 5 last night. At 7, the three large theaters here, all in a rush of good business, were stricken with paralysis. At 8, our long line of outsiders waiting for unoccupied places was nowhere. Today you hear all the people in the streets talking of only one thing. I shall suppress my next week's promised readings by good fortune, not yet announced, and watch the course of events. Nothing in this country, as I before said, lasts long, and I think it likely that the public may be heartily tired of the President's name by the 9th of March, when I read at a considerable distance from here. So behold me with a whole week's holiday in view. 2 days later, he wrote pleasantly to his sister-in-law of his audiences. They have come to regard the readings and the reader as their peculiar property, and you would be both amused and pleased if you could see the curious way in which they show this increased interest in both. Whenever they laugh or cry, they have taken to applauding as well, and the result is very inspiriting. I shall remain here until Saturday the 7th, but after tomorrow night shall not read here until the 1st of April, when I begin my farewell 6 in number. On the 28th he wrote, "Tomorrow fortnight we purpose being at the Falls of Niagara, and then we shall come back and really begin to wind up. I have got to know the carol so well that I cannot remember it, and occasionally go dodging about in the wildest manner, to pick up lost pieces. They took it so tremendously last night that I was stopped every 5 minutes. One poor young girl in mourning burst into a passion of grief about Tiny Tim and was taken out. We had a fine house, and in the interval while I was out, they covered the little table with flowers. The cough has taken a fresh start as if it were a novelty, and is even worse than ever today. There is a lull in the excitement about the president, but the articles of impeachment are to be produced this afternoon, and then it may set in again. Osgood came into camp last night from selling in remote places, and reports that at Rochester and Buffalo, both places near the frontier, tickets were bought by Canada people, who had struggled across the frozen river and clambered over all sorts of obstructions to get them. Some of those distant halls turn out to be smaller than represented, but I have no doubt use an American expression that we shall get along. The second half of the receipts cannot reasonably be expected to come up to the first, political circumstances and all other surroundings considered. His old ill luck in travel pursued him. On the day his letter was written, a snowstorm began, with a heavy gale of wind, and after all the hard weather gone through, he wrote on the 2nd of March, "This is the worst day we have seen." It is telegraphed that the storm prevails over an immense extent of country, and is just the same at Chicago as here. I hope it may prove a wind-up. We are getting sick of the very sound of sleigh bells even. The roads were so bad and the trains so much out of time that he had to start a day earlier, and on the 6th of March his tour northwest began, with the gale still blowing and the snow falling heavily. On the 13th he wrote to me from Buffalo. "We go to the Falls of Niagara tomorrow for our own pleasure, and I take all the men as a treat. We found Rochester last Tuesday in a very curious state. Perhaps you know that the great falls of the Genesee River, really very fine, even so near Niagara, are at that place. In the height of a sudden thaw, an immense bank of ice above the rapids refused to yield, so that the town was threatened for the second time in 4 years with submersion. Boats were ready in the streets, all the people were up all night, and none but the children slept. In the dead of the night a thundering noise was heard, the ice gave way, the swollen river came raging and roaring down the falls, and the town was safe. Very picturesque, but not very good for business, as the manager says. Especially as the hall stands in the center of danger, and had 10 feet of water in it on the last occasion of flood. But I think we had above 200 English. On the previous night at Syracusa, most out of the way and unintelligible looking place, with apparently no people in it, we had 375 odd. Here, we had last night, and shall have tonight, whatever we can cram into the hall. This Buffalo has become a large and important town, with numbers of German and Irish in it. But it is very curious to notice, as we touch the frontier, that the American female beauty dies out, and a woman's face clumsily compounded of German, Irish, Western America, and Canadian, not yet fused together and not yet molded, obtains instead. Our show of beauty at night is generally remarkable, but we had not a dozen pretty women in the whole throng last night, and the faces were all blunt. I have just been walking about and observing the same thing in the streets. The winter has been so severe that the hotel on the English side at Niagara, which has the best view of the falls, and is for that reason very preferable, is not yet open. So we go, perforce, to the American, which telegraphs back to our telegram, all Mr. Dickens's requirements perfectly understood. I have not yet been in more than two very bad inns. I have been in some, where a good deal of what is popularly called slopping round has prevailed, but have been able to get on very well. Slopping round, so used, means untidiness and disorder. It is a comically expressive phrase and has many meanings. Fields was asking the price of a quarter cask of sherry the other day. While Musser Fields, the merchant replies, that varies according to quality, as is but natural. If you're want a sherry just to slop round with it, I can fix you some at a very low figure. His letter was resumed at Rochester on the 18th. After two most brilliant days at the Falls of Niagara, we got back here last night. Tomorrow morning we turn out at 6 for a long railway journey back to Albany. But it is nearly all back now, thank God. I do not know how long, though, before turning, we might have gone on at Buffalo. We went everywhere at the falls and saw them in every aspect. There is a suspension bridge across, now, some 2 miles or more from the horseshoe, and another half a mile nearer is to be opened in July. They are very fine but very ticklish, hanging aloft there, in the continual vibration of the thundering water, nor is one greatly reassured by the printed notice that troops must not cross them at step, that bands of music must not play in crossing, and the like. I shall never forget the last aspect in which we saw Niagara yesterday. We had been everywhere when I thought of struggling in an open carriage up some very difficult ground for a good distance, and getting where we could stand above the river and see it, as it rushes forward to its tremendous leap, coming for miles and miles. All away to the horizon on our right was a wonderful confusion of bright green and white water. As we stood watching it with our faces to the top of the falls, our backs were towards the sun. The majestic valley below the falls, so seen through the vast cloud of spray, was made of rainbow. The high banks, the riven rocks, the forests, the bridge, the buildings, the air, the sky were all made of rainbow. Nothing in Turner's finest watercolor drawings, done in his greatest day, is so ethereal, so imaginative, so gorgeous in color, as what I then beheld. I seemed to be lifted from the earth and to be looking into heaven. What I once said to you, as I witnessed the scene 25 years ago, all came back at this most affecting and sublime sight. The muddy vesture of our clay falls from us as we look. I chartered a separate carriage for our men, so that they might see all in their own way and at their own time. There is a great deal of water out between Rochester and New York, and traveling is very uncertain, as I fear we may find tomorrow. There is again some little alarm here on account of the river rising too fast, but our tonight's house is far ahead of the first. Most charming halls in these places, excellent for sight and sound. Almost invariably built as theaters, with stage, scenery, and good dressing rooms. Audience seated to perfection, every seat always separate, excellent doorways and passages, and brilliant light. My screen and gas are set up in front of the drop curtain, and the most delicate touches will tell anywhere. No creature but my own men ever near me. His anticipation of the uncertainty that might beset his travel back had dismal fulfillment. It is described in a letter written on the 21st from Springfield to his valued friend, Mr. Frederick Ouvry, having much interest of its own, and making lively addition to the picture which these chapters give. The unflagging spirit that bears up under all disadvantages is again marvelously shown. You can hardly imagine what my life is with its present condition, show hard the work is, and how little time I seem to have at my disposal. It is necessary to the daily recovery of my voice that I should dine at 3 when not traveling. I begin to prepare for the evening at 6, and I get back to my hotel, pretty well knocked up, at 10:30. Add to all this perpetual railway traveling in one of the severest winters ever known, and you will descry a reason or two for my being an indifferent correspondent. Last Sunday evening, I left the Falls of Niagara for this and two intervening places. As there was a great thaw, and the melted snow was swelling all the rivers, the whole country for 300 miles was flooded. On the Tuesday afternoon, I had read on the Monday the train gave in, as under circumstances utterly hopeless, and stopped at a place called Utica, the greater part of which was under water, while the high and dry part could produce nothing particular to eat. Here, some of the wretched passengers passed the night in the train, while others stormed the hotel. I was fortunate enough to get a bedroom, and garnished it with an enormous jug of gin punch, over which I and the manager played a double dummy rubber. At 6 in the morning, we were knocked up, to come aboard and try it. At 6:30, we were knocked up again with the tidings that it was of no use coming aboard or trying it. At 8, all the bells in the town were set a-going, to summon us to come aboard instantly. And so we started, through the water at 4 or 5 miles an hour, seeing nothing but drowned farms, barns adrift like Noah's arks, deserted villages, broken bridges, and all manner of ruin. I was to read at Albany that night, and all the tickets were sold. A very active superintendent of works assured me that if I could be got along, he was the man to get me along, and that if I could not be got along, I might conclude that it could not possibly be fixed. He then turned on 100 men in 7-leg boots, who went ahead of the train, each armed with a long pole and pushing the blocks of ice away. Following this cavalcade, we got to land at last, and arrived in time for me to read the carol and trial triumphantly. My people, I had 5 of the staff with me, turned to at their work with a will, and did a day's labor in a couple of hours. If we had not come in as we did, I should have lost 350, and Albany would have gone distracted. You may conceive what the flood was, when I hint at the 2 most notable incidents of our journey. 1, we took the passengers out of 2 trains, who had been in the water, immovable all night and all the previous day. 2, we released a large quantity of sheep and cattle from trucks that had been in the water I do not know how long, but so long that the creatures in them had begun to eat each other, and presented a most horrible spectacle. Besides Springfield, he had engagements at Portland, New Bedford, and other places in Massachusetts, before the Boston farewells began, and there wanted but 2 days to bring him to that time, when he thus described to his daughter the labor which was to occupy them. His letter was from Portland on the 29th of March, and it will be observed that he no longer compromises or glozes over what he was and had been suffering. During his terrible travel to Albany his cough had somewhat spared him, but the old illness had broken out in his foot, and though he persisted in ascribing it to the former supposed origin having been lately again wet, from walking in melted snow, which I supposed to be the occasion of its swelling in the old way, it troubled him sorely, extended now at intervals to the right foot also, and lamed him for all the time he remained. In the States, I should have writ to you by the last mail, but I really was too unwell to do it. The writing day was last Friday, when I ought to have left Boston for New Bedford 55 miles before 11 in the morning. But I was so exhausted that I could not be got up, and had to take my chance of an evening train's producing me in time to read which at just 999. With the return of snow, 9 days ago, my cough became as bad as ever. I have coughed every morning from 2 or 3 till 5 or 6, and have been absolutely sleepless. I have had no appetite besides, and no taste. Last night here I took some laudanum, and it is the only thing that has done me good, though it made me sick this morning. But the life in this climate is so very hard. When I did manage to get to New Bedford, I read with my utmost force and vigor. Next morning, well or ill, I must turn out at 7 to get back to Boston on my way here. I dined at Boston at 3, and at 5 had to come on here 130 miles or so for tomorrow night, there being no Sunday train. Tomorrow night I read here in a very large place, and Tuesday morning at 6 I must again start, to get back to Boston once more. But after tomorrow night, I have only the farewells, thank God. Even as it is, however, I have had to write to Dolby, who is in New York, to see my doctor there, and ask him to send me some composing medicine that I can take at night, inasmuch as without sleep I cannot get through. However sympathetic and devoted the people are about one, they cannot be got to comprehend, seeing me able to do the 2 hours when the time comes round, that it may also involve much misery. To myself on the 30th he wrote from the same place, making like confession. No comment could deepen the sadness of the story of suffering, revealed in his own simple language. I write in a town 3 parts of which were burnt down in a tremendous fire 3 years ago. The people lived in tents while their city was rebuilding. The charred trunks of the trees with which the streets of the old city were planted, yet stand here and there in the new thoroughfares like black specters. The rebuilding is still in progress everywhere. Yet such is the astonishing energy of the people that the large hall in which I am to read tonight, its predecessor, was burnt, would compare very favorably with the Free Trade Hall at Manchester. I am nearly used up. Climate, distance, catarrh, traveling, and hard work have begun, I may say so, now they are nearly all over, to tell heavily upon me. Sleeplessness besets me, and if I had engaged to go on into May, I think I must have broken down. It was well that I cut off the far west in Canada when I 999. There would else have been a sad complication. It is impossible to make the people about one understand. However zealous and devoted, it is impossible even to make Dolby understand until the pinch comes, that the power of coming up to the mark every night, with spirits and spirit, may coexist with the nearest approach to sinking under it. When I got back to Boston on Thursday, after a very hard 3 weeks, I saw that Fields was very grave about my going on to New Bedford 55 miles next day, and then coming on here 180 miles next day. But the stress is over, and so I can afford to look back upon it and think about it and write about it. On the 31st, he closed his letter at Boston, and he was at home when I heard of him again. The latest intelligence, my dear old fellow, is that I have arrived here safely and that I am certainly better. I consider my work virtually over now. My impression is that the political crisis will damage the farewells by about one half. I cannot yet speak by the card, but my predictions here as to our proceedings have thus far been invariably right. We took last night at Portland, 360 English, where a costly Italian troupe, using the same hall tonight, had not booked 14. It is the same all over the country, and the worst is not seen yet. Everything is becoming absorbed in the presidential impeachment, helped by the next presidential election. Connecticut is particularly excited. The night after I read at Hartford this last week, there were two political meetings in the town, meetings of two parties, and the hotel was full of speakers coming in from outlying places. So at New Haven, the moment I had finished, carpenters came in to prepare for next night's politics. So at Buffalo, so everywhere very soon. In the same tone, he wrote his last letter to his sister-in-law from Boston. My notion of the farewells is pretty certain now to turn out right. We had 300 English here last night. Today is a fast day, and tonight we shall probably take much less. Then it is likely that we shall pull up again and strike a good reasonable average, but it is not at all probable that we shall do anything enormous. Every pulpit in Massachusetts will resound with violent politics today and tonight. That was on the 2nd of April, and a postscript was added. Friday afternoon the 3rd, Qatar worse than ever, and we do not know at 4 o'clock whether I can read tonight or must stop. Otherwise, all well. Dickens's last letter from America was written to his daughter Mary from Boston on the 9th of April, the day before his sixth and last farewell night. I not only read last Friday when I was doubtful of being able to do so, but read as I never did before, and astonished the audience quite as much as myself. You never saw or heard such a scene of excitement. Longfellow and all the Cambridge men have urged me to give in. I have been very near doing so, but feel stronger today. I cannot tell whether the catarrh may have done me any lasting injury in the lungs or other breathing organs until I shall have rested and got home. I hope and believe not. Consider the weather. There have been 2 snowstorms since I wrote last, and today the town is blotted out in a ceaseless whirl of snow and wind. Dolby is as tender as a woman and as watchful as a doctor. He never leaves me during the reading now, but sits at the side of the platform and keeps his eye upon me all the time. Ditto George the gasman, steadiest and most reliable man I ever employed. I have Dommy to do tonight and must go through it carefully, so here ends my report. The personal affection of the people in this place is charming to the last. Did I tell you that the New York press are going to give me a public dinner on Saturday the 18th? In New York, where there were 5 farewell nights, $3,298 were the receipts of the last, on the 20th of April. Those of the last at Boston, on the 8th, having been $3,456. But on earlier nights in the same cities respectively, these sums also had been reached. And indeed, making allowance for an exceptional night here and there, the receipts varied so wonderfully little that a mention of the highest average returns from other places will give no exaggerated impression of the ordinary receipts throughout. Excluding fractions of dollars, the lowest were New Bedford 1640, Rochester 1906, Springfield 1970, and Providence 2140. Albany and Worcester averaged something less than 2,400, while Hartford, Buffalo, Baltimore, Syracuse, New Haven, and Portland rose to 2,600. Washington's last night was 2,610, no night there having less than 2,500. Philadelphia exceeded Washington by 300, and Brooklyn went ahead of Philadelphia by 200. The amount taken at the 4 Brooklyn readings was $11,128. The New York public dinner was given at Delmonico's. The hosts were more than 200, and the chair was taken by Mr. Horace Greeley. Dickens attended with great difficulty and spoke in pain. But he used the occasion to bear his testimony to the changes of 25 years, the rise of vast new cities, growth in the graces and amenities of life, much improvement in the press, essential to every other advance, and changes in himself leading to opinions more deliberately formed. He promised his kindly entertainers that no copy of his notes, or his Chuzzlewit, should in future be issued by him without accompanying mention of the changes to which he had referred that night, of the politeness, delicacy, sweet temper, hospitality, and consideration in all ways for which he had to thank them, and of his gratitude for the respect shown, during all his visit, to the privacy enforced upon him by the nature of his work and the condition of his health. He had to leave the room before the proceedings were over. On the following Monday, he read to his last American audience, telling them at the close that he hoped often to recall them, equally by his winter fire and in the green summer weather, and never as a mere public audience but as a host of personal friends. He sailed 2 days later in the Russia and reached England in the first week of May 1868. Chapter 17, Last Readings. 18,680,1870. At home project for last readings what the readings did, and undid profit from all the readings noticeable changes proposed reading from Oliver, twist parting from his youngest son death of his brother Frederick old friends Sykes, and Nancy reading stop Mr. Syme's opinion of the lameness Emerson Tennant's funeral public dinner, in Liverpool his description of his illness brought to town Sir Thomas Watson's, note of the case close of career as public reader. Favorable weather helped him pleasantly home. He had profited greatly by the sea voyage, perhaps greatly more by its repose, and on the 25th of May he described himself to his Boston friends as brown beyond belief, and causing the greatest disappointment in all quarters by looking so well. My doctor was quite broken down in spirits on seeing me for the first time last Saturday. Good Lord, 7 years younger, said the doctor, recoiling, that he gave all the credit to those fine days at sea, and none to the rest from such labors as he had passed through, the close of the letter too sadly showed. We are already settling, think of this, the details of my farewell course of readings. Even on his way out to America that enterprise was in hand. From Halifax he had written to me. I told the Chapels that when I got back to England, I would have a series of farewell readings in town and country, and then read no more. They at once offer in writing to pay all expenses whatever, to pay the 10%, for management, and to pay me, for a series of 6,000 pounds. The terms were raised and settled before the first Boston readings closed. The number was to be 100, and the payment, over and above expenses and percentage, 8,000 pounds. Such a temptation undoubtedly was great, and though it was a fatal mistake which Dickens committed in yielding to it, it was not an ignoble one. He did it under no excitement from the American gains, of which he knew nothing when he pledged himself to the enterprise. No man could care essentially less for mere money than he 999. But the necessary provision for many sons was a constant anxiety. He was proud of what the readings had done to abridge this care, and the very strain of them, under which it seemed certain that his health had first given way, and which he always steadily refused to connect especially with them, had also broken the old confidence of being at all times available for his higher pursuit. What affected his health only he would not regard as part of the question either way. That was to be borne as the lot more or less of all men, and the more thorough he could make his feeling of independence, and of ability to rest, by what was now in hand, the better his final chances of a perfect recovery would be. That was the spirit in which he entered on this last engagement. It was an opportunity offered for making a particular work really complete before he should abandon it forever. Something of it will not be indiscernible even in the summary of his past acquisitions, which with a pardonable exultation he now sent me. We had great difficulty in getting our American accounts squared to the point of ascertaining what Dolby's commission amounted to in English money. After all, we were obliged to call in the aid of a money changer, to determine what he should pay as his share of the average loss of conversion into gold. With this deduction made, I think his commission, I have not the figures at hand, was 2888. Ticknor and Fields had a commission of 1,000, besides 5%, on all Boston receipts. The expenses in America to the day of our sailing were $38,948, roughly $39,000, or 13,000. The preliminary expenses were 614. The average price of gold was nearly 40%. And yet my profit was within 100 or so of 20,000. Supposing me to have got through the present engagement in good health, I shall have made by the readings, in 2 years, 33,000. That is to say, 13,000 received from the chapels, and 20,000 from America. What I had made by them before, I could only ascertain by a long examination of Couts's books. I should say, certainly not less than 10,000, for I remember that I made half that money in the first town and country campaign with poor Arthur Smith. These figures are of course between ourselves, but do not you think them rather remarkable? The chapel bargain began with 50 a night and everything paid, then became 60, and now rises to 80. The last readings were appointed to begin with October, and at the request of an old friend, Chauncey Hare Townshend, who died during his absence in the States, he had accepted the trust, which occupied him some part of the summer, of examining and selecting for publication a bequest of some papers on matters of religious belief, which were issued in a small volume the following year. There came also in June a visit from Longfellow and his daughters, with later summer visits from the Eliot Nortons, and at the arrival of friends whom he loved and honored as he did these, from the great country to which he owed so much, infinite were the rejoicings of Gad's Hill. Nothing could quench his old spirit in this way. But in the intervals of my official work, I saw him frequently that summer, and never without the impression that America had told heavily upon him. There was manifest abatement of his natural force, the elasticity of bearing was impaired, and the wonderful brightness of eye was dimmed at times. One day, too, as he walked from his office with Miss Hogarth to dine at our house, he could read only the halves of the letters over the shop doors that were on his right as he looked. He attributed it to medicine. It was an additional unfavorable symptom that his right foot had become affected as well as the left, though not to anything like the same extent, during the journey from the Canada frontier to Boston. But all this disappeared, upon any special cause for exertion, and he was never unprepared to lavish freely for others the reserved strength that should have been kept for himself. This indeed was the great danger, for it dulled the apprehension of us all to the fact that absolute and pressing danger did positively exist. He had scarcely begun these last readings than he was beset by a misgiving that, for a success large enough to repay Messrs. Chappell's liberality, the enterprise would require a new excitement to carry him over the old ground, and it was while engaged in Manchester and Liverpool at the outset of October that this announcement came. I have made a short reading of the murder in Oliver Twist. I cannot make up my mind, however, whether to do it or not. I have no doubt that I could perfectly petrify an audience by carrying out the notion I have of the way of rendering it, but whether the impression would not be so horrible as to keep them away another time is what I cannot satisfy myself upon. What do you think? It is in three short parts. 1. Where Fagin sets Noah Claypole on to watch Nancy. 2. The scene on London Bridge. 3. Where Fagin rouses Claypole from his sleep to tell his perverted story to Sykes. And the murder and the murderer's sense of being haunted. I have adapted and cut about the text with great care, and it is very powerful. I have today referred the book and the question to the chapels as so largely interested. I had a strong dislike to this proposal, less perhaps on the ground which ought to have been taken of the physical exertion it would involve, than because such a subject seemed to be altogether out of the province of reading, and it was resolved that, before doing it, trial should be made to a limited private audience in St. James's Hall. The note announcing this, from Liverpool on the 25th of October, is for other reasons worth printing. I give you earliest notice that the chapels suggest to me the 18th of November the 14th was chosen for trial of the Oliver Twist murder, when everything in use for the previous day's reading can be made available. I hope this may suit you. We have been doing well here, and how it was arranged, nobody knows, but we had 410 at St. James's Hall last Tuesday, having advanced from our previous 360. The expenses are such, however, on the princely scale of the chapels, that we never begin at a smaller, often at a larger, cost than 180. I have not been well and have been heavily tired. However, I have little to complain of nothing, though like Mariana I am orrery. But think of this. If all go well, and like Mr. Dennis I work off this series triumphantly, I shall have made of these readings 28,000 in a year and a half. This did not better reconcile me to what had been too clearly forced upon him by the supposed necessity of some new excitement to ensure a triumphant result. And even the private rehearsal only led to a painful correspondence between us, of which a few words are all that need now be preserved. We might have agreed, he wrote, to differ about it very well, because we only wanted to find out the truth if we could, and because it was quite understood that I wanted to leave behind me the recollection of something very passionate and dramatic, done with simple means, if the art would justify the theme. Apart from mere personal considerations, The whole question lay in these last words. It was impossible for me to admit that the effect to be produced was legitimate, or such as it was desirable to associate with the recollection of his readings. Mention should not be omitted of two sorrows which affected him at this time. At the close of the month before the readings began, his youngest son went forth from home to join an elder brother in Australia. These partings are hard, hard things, 26th of September, but they are the lot of us all, and might have to be done without means or influence, and then would be far harder. God bless him. Hardly a month later, the last of his surviving brothers, Frederick, the next to himself, died at Darlington. He had been tended 24th of October with the greatest care and affection by some local friends. It was a wasted life, but God forbid that one should be hard upon it, or upon anything in this world that is not deliberately and coldly wrong. Before October closed, the renewal of his labor had begun to tell upon him. He wrote to his sister-in-law on the 29th of sickness and sleepless nights, and of its having become necessary, when he had to read, that he should lie on the sofa all day. After arrival at Edinburgh in December, he had been making a calculation that the railway traveling over such a distance involved something more than 30,000 shocks to the nerves. But he went on to Christmas, alternating these far-off places with nights regularly intervening in London, without much more complaint than of an inability to sleep. Trade reverses at Glasgow had checked the success there, but Edinburgh made compensation. The affectionate regard of the people exceeds all bounds and is shown in every way. The audiences do everything but embrace me, and take as much pains with the readings as I do. The keeper of the Edinburgh Hall, a fine old soldier, presented me on Friday night with the most superb red camellia for my buttonhole that ever was seen. Nobody can imagine how he came by it, as the florists had had a considerable demand for that color, from ladies in the stalls, and could get no such thing. The second portion of the enterprise opened with the new year, and the Sykes and Nancy scenes, everywhere his prominent subject, exacted the most terrible physical exertion from him. In January he was at Clifton, where he had given, he told his sister-in-law, by far the best murder yet done, while at the same date he wrote to his daughter, "At Clifton on Monday night we had a contagion of fainting, and yet the place was not hot. I should think we had from a dozen to 20 ladies taken out stiff and rigid at various times. It became quite ridiculous." He was afterwards at Cheltenham. Macready is of opinion that the murder is two Macbeths. He declares that he heard every word of the reading, but I doubt it. Alas, he is sadly infirm. On the 27th, he wrote to his daughter from Torquay that the place into which they had put him to read, and where a pantomime had been played the night before, was something between a Methodist chapel, a theatre, a circus, a riding school, and a cowhouse. That day he wrote to me from Bath. "Lander's ghost goes along the silent streets here before me. The place looks to me like a cemetery which the dead have succeeded in rising and taking. Having built streets of their old gravestones, they wander about scantly trying to look alive. A dead failure." In the second week of February he was in London, under engagement to return to Scotland, which he had just left after the usual weekly reading at St. James's Hall, when there was a sudden interruption. "My foot has turned lame again," was his announcement to me on the 15th, followed next day by this letter. "Henry Thompson will not let me read tonight, and will not let me go to Scotland tomorrow. Tremendous house here, and also in Edinburgh." Here is the certificate he drew up for himself and Beard to sign. "We the undersigned hereby certify that Mr. 500 is suffering from inflammation of the foot caused by overexertion, and that we have forbidden his appearance on the platform this evening, as he must keep his room for a day or two. I have sent up to the Great Western Hotel for apartments, and, if I can get them, shall move there this evening. Heaven knows what engagements this may involve in April. It throws us all back, and will cost me some £500. A few days' rest again brought so much relief that, against the urgent entreaties of members of his family as well as other friends, he was in the railway carriage bound for Edinburgh on the morning of the 20th of February, accompanied by Mr. Chappell himself. I came down lazily on a sofa. He wrote to me from Edinburgh next day, hardly changing my position the whole way. The railway authorities had done all sorts of things, and I was more comfortable than on the sofa at the hotel. The foot gave me no uneasiness, and has been quiet and steady all night. He was nevertheless under the necessity, 2 days later, of consulting Mr. Syme, and he told his daughter that this great authority had warned him against overfatigue in the readings, and given him some slight remedies, but otherwise reported him in juiced perfectly splendid condition. With care, he thought the pain might be got rid of. Wat Mad Thompson think it was goot? He said often, and seemed to take that opinion extremely 99. Again, before leaving Scotland, he saw Mr. Syme, and wrote to me on the 2nd of March of the indignation with which he again treated the gout diagnosis, declaring the disorder to be an affection of the delicate nerves and muscles originating in cold. I told him that it had shewn itself in America in the other foot as well. "Knew I will ju swear," said he, "that I on the fatigue o' the readings ye'd been tramping ith snaw within 2 or 3 days. I certainly had." "Well," said he triumphantly, "and who did it first begin?" "Ith snaw. Goot, ba Thompson knew no other name for it, and just caught it goot bow, for which he took 2 guineas. Yet the famous pupil, Sir Henry Thompson, went certainly nearer the mark than the distinguished master, Mr. Syme, in giving to it a more than local character." The whole of that March month he went on with the scenes from Oliver Twist. "The foot goes famously," he wrote to his daughter. "I feel the fatigue in it 4 murders in 1 week, but not overmuch. It merely aches at night, and so does the other, sympathetically, I suppose." At Hull on the 8th he heard of the death of the old and dear friend, Emerson Tennant, to whom he had inscribed his last book, and on the morning of the 12th I met him at the funeral. He had read the Oliver Twist scenes the night before at York, had just been able to get to the express train, after shortening the pauses in the reading by a violent rush when it was over, and had traveled through the night. He appeared to me dazed and worn. No man could well look more so than he did that sorrowful morning. The end was near. A public dinner, which will have mention on a later page, had been given him in Liverpool on the 10th of April, with Lord Dufferin in the chair, and a reading was due from him in Preston on the 22nd of that month. But on Sunday the 18th we had ill report of him from Chester, and on the 21st he wrote from Blackpool to his sister-in-law. "I have come to the Sea Beach Hotel charming for a day's rest. I am much better than I was on Sunday, but shall want careful looking too, to get through the readings. My weakness and deadness are all on the left side, and if I do not look at anything I try to touch with my left hand, I do not know where it is. I am in secret consultation with Frank Beard, who says that I have given him indisputable evidences of overwork which he could wish to treat immediately, and so I have telegraphed for him. I have had a delicious walk by the sea today, and I sleep soundly, and have picked up amazingly in appetite. My foot is greatly better, too, and I wear my own boot." Next day was appointed for the reading at Preston, and from that place he wrote to me, while waiting the arrival of Mr. Beard. "Do not say anything about it, but the tremendously severe nature of this work is a little shaking me. At Chester last Sunday I found myself extremely giddy and extremely uncertain of my sense of touch, both in the left leg and the left hand and arms. I had been taking some slight medicine of Beard's, and immediately wrote to him describing exactly what I felt and asking him whether those feelings could be referable to the medicine. He promptly replied, "There can be no mistaking them from your exact account. The medicine cannot possibly have caused them. I recognize indisputable symptoms of overwork, and I wish to take you in hand without any loss of time. They have greatly modified since, but he is coming down here this afternoon. Tomorrow night at Warrington, I shall have but 25 more nights to work through. If he can coach me up for them, I do not doubt that I shall get all right again as I did when I became free in America. The foot has given me very little trouble. Yet it is remarkable that it is the left foot too, and that I told Henry Thompson, before I saw his old master Syme, that I had an inward conviction that whatever it was not gout. I also told Beard, a year after the Staplehurst accident, that I was certain that my heart had been fluttered and wanted a little helping. This the stethoscope confirmed, and considering the immense exertion I am undergoing, and the constant jarring of express trains, the case seems to me quite intelligible. Do not say anything in the Gad's direction about my being a little out of sorts. I have broached the matter, of course, but very lightly. Indeed, there is no reason for broaching it otherwise." Even to the close of that letter, he had buoyed himself up with the hope that he might yet be coached, and that the readings need not be discontinued. But Mr. Beard stopped them at once, and brought his patient to London. On Friday morning the 23rd, the same envelope brought me a note from himself to say that he was well enough, but tired, in perfectly good spirits, not at all uneasy, and writing this himself that I should have it under his own hand, with a note from his eldest son to say that his father appeared to him to be very ill, and that a consultation had been appointed with Sir Thomas Watson. The statement of that distinguished physician, sent to myself in June 1872, completes for the present the sorrowful narrative. It was, I think, on the 23rd of April 1869 that I was asked to see Charles Dickens, in consultation with Mr. Carbeard. After I got home, I jotted down, from their joint account, what follows. After unusual irritability, 100, 500, found himself, last Saturday or Sunday, giddy, with a tendency to go backwards and to turn round. Afterwards, desiring to put something on a small table, he pushed it and the table forwards undesignedly. He had some odd feeling of insecurity about his left leg, as if there was something unnatural about his heel, but he could lift and he did not drag his leg. Also, he spoke of some strangeness of his left hand and arm, missed the spot on which he wished to lay that hand unless he carefully looked at it, felt an unreadiness to lift his hands towards his head, especially his left hand when, for instance, he was brushing his hair. He had written thus to Mr. Carbeard. Is it possible that anything in my medicine can have made me extremely giddy, extremely uncertain of my footing, especially on the left side, and extremely indisposed to raise my hands to my head? These symptoms made me very uncomfortable on Saturday Kai. Sunday, night, and all yesterday 100. The state thus described showed plainly that 100, 500, had been on the brink of an attack of paralysis of his left side, and possibly of apoplexy. It was, no doubt, the result of extreme hurry, overwork, and excitement, incidental to his readings. On hearing from him, Mr. Carbeard had gone at once to Preston, or Blackburn, I am not sure which, had forbidden his reading that same evening, and had brought him to London. When I saw him, he appeared to be well. His mind was unclouded, his pulse quiet. His heart was beating with some slight excess of the natural impulse. He told me he had of late sometimes, but rarely, lost or misused a word, that he forgot names and numbers but had always done that, and he promised implicit obedience to our injunctions. We gave him the following certificate. The undersigned certify that Mr. Charles Dickens has been seriously unwell, through great exhaustion and fatigue of body and mind, consequent upon his public readings and long and frequent railway journeys. In our judgment, Mr. Dickens will not be able with safety to himself to resume his readings for several months to come. Those Watson 1500 F. Carbeard. However, after some weeks, he expressed a wish for my sanction to his endeavors to redeem, in a careful and moderate way, some of the reading engagements to which he had been pledged before those threatenings of brain mischief in the north of England. As he had continued uniformly to seem and to feel perfectly well, I did not think myself warranted to refuse that sanction, and in writing to enforce great caution in the trials, I expressed some apprehension that he might fancy we had been too peremptory in. Our injunctions of mental and bodily repose in April, and I quoted the following remark, which occurs somewhere in one of Captain Cook's voyages. Preventive measures are always invidious, for when most successful, the necessity for them is the least apparent. I mention this to explain the letter which I send herewith, and which I must beg you to return to me, as a precious remembrance of the writer with whom I had long enjoyed very friendly and much valued relations. I scarcely need say that if what I have now written can, in any way, be of use to you, it is entirely at your service and disposal, nor need I say with how much interest I have read the first volume of your late friend's life. I cannot help regretting that a great pressure of professional work at the time prevented my making a fuller record of a case so interesting. The 12 readings to which Sir Thomas Watson consented, with the condition that railway travel was not to accompany them, were farther to be delayed until the opening months of 1870. They were an offering from Dickens by way of small compensation to Messrs. Chappell for the breakdown of the enterprise on which they had staked so much. But here practically he finished his career as a public reader, and what remains will come with the end of what is yet to be told. One effort only intervened, by which he hoped to get happily back to his old pursuits. But to this, as to that which preceded it, sterner fate said also no, and his last book, like his last readings, prematurely closed. Chapter 18, Last Book. 18,690,1870. First fancy for Edwin Drood's story, as planned in his mind nothing written, of his intentions merits of the fragment comparison of his early and his late MSS. Discovery of unpublished seem probable reason for writing it in advance how Mr. Sapsea ceased to be a member of the 8 Club. The last book undertaken by Dickens was to be published in illustrated monthly numbers of the old form, but to close with the 12th. It closed, unfinished, with the sixth number, which was itself underwritten by 2 pages. His first fancy for the tale was expressed in a letter in the middle of July. What should you think of the idea of a story beginning in this way? Two people, boy and girl, or very young, going apart from one another, pledged to be married after many years at the end of the book. The interest to arise out of the tracing of their separate ways, and the impossibility of telling what will be done with that impending fate. This was laid aside, but it left a marked trace on the story as afterwards designed, in the position of Edwin Drood and his betrothed. I first heard of the later design in a letter dated Friday, the 6th of August, 1869, in which, after speaking, with the usual unstinted praise he bestowed always on what moved him in others, of a little tale he had received for his journal, he spoke of the change that had occurred to him for the new tale by himself. I laid aside the fancy I told you of, and have a very curious and new idea for my new story. Not a communicable idea, or the interest of the book would be gone, but a very strong one, though difficult to work. The story, I learnt immediately afterward, was to be that of the murder of a nephew by his uncle, the originality of which was to consist in the review of the murderer's career by himself at the close, when its temptations were to be dwelt upon as if, not he the culprit, but some other man, were the tempted. The last chapters were to be written in the condemned cell, to which his wickedness, all elaborately elicited from him as if told of another, had brought him. Discovery by the murderer of the utter needlessness of the murder for its object was to follow hard upon commission of the deed, but all discovery of the murderer was to be baffled till towards the close, when, by means of a gold ring which had resisted the corrosive effects of the lime into which he had thrown the body, not only the person murdered was to be identified, but the locality of the crime and the man who committed it. So much was told to me before any of the book was written, and it will be recollected that the ring, taken by Drood to be given to his betrothed only if their engagement went on, was brought away with him from their last interview. Rosa was to marry Tartar, and Crisparkle the sister of Landless, who was himself, I think, to have perished in assisting Tartar finally to unmask and seize the murderer. Nothing had been written, however, of the main parts of the design, excepting what is found in the published numbers. There was no hint or preparation for the sequel in any notes of chapters in advance, and there remained not even what he had himself so sadly written of the book by Thackeray, also interrupted by death. The evidence of matured designs never to be accomplished, intentions planned never to be executed, roads of thought marked out never to be traversed, goals shining in the distance never to be reached, was wanting here. It was all a blank. Enough had been completed nevertheless to give promise of a much greater book than its immediate predecessor. I hope his book is finished, wrote Longfellow when the news of his death was flashed to America. It is certainly one of his most beautiful works, if not the most beautiful of all. It would be too sad to think the pen had fallen from his hand and left it incomplete. Some of its characters were touched with subtlety, and in its descriptions his imaginative power was at its best. Not a line was wanting to the reality, in the most minute local detail, of places the most widely contrasted, and we saw with equal vividness the lazy cathedral town and the lurid opium eater's den. Something like the old lightness and buoyancy of animal spirits gave a new freshness to the humor. The scenes of the child heroine and her luckless betrothed had both novelty and nicety of character in them, and Mr. Grewgious in chambers with his clerk and the 2 waiters, the conceited fool Sapsy, and the blustering philanthropist Honeythunder, were first-rate comedy. Miss Twinkleton was of the family of Miss La Creevy, and the lodging-house keeper, Miss Billiken, though she gave Miss Twinkleton but a sorry account of her blood, had that of Mrs. Todgers in her veins. I was put in life to a very genteel boarding school, the mistress being no less a lady than yourself, of about your own age, or it may be, some years younger, and a poorness of blood flowed from the table which has run through my life. Was ever anything better said of a school fare of starved gentility? The last page of Edwin Drood was written in the chalet, in the afternoon of his last day of consciousness, and I have thought there might be some interest in a facsimile of the greater part of this final page of manuscript that ever came from his hand, at which he had worked unusually late in order to finish the chapter. It has very much the character, in its excessive care of correction and interlineation, of all his later manuscripts, and in order that comparison may be made with his earlier and easier method, I placed beside it a portion of a page of the original of Oliver Twist. His greater pains and elaboration of writing, it may be mentioned, become first very obvious in the later parts of Martin Chuzzlewit. But not the least remarkable feature in all his manuscripts is the accuracy with which the portions of each representing the several numbers are exactly adjusted to the space the printer had to fill. Whether without erasure or so interlined as to be illegible, nothing is wanting, and there is nothing in excess. So assured was the habit that he has himself remarked upon an instance the other way, in our mutual friend, as not having happened to him for 30 years. But Edwin Drood more startlingly showed him how unsettled the habit he most prized had become in the clashing of old and new pursuits. When I had written 22nd of December 1869, and, as I thought, disposed of the first two numbers of my story, Clowes informed me to my horror that they were, together, 12 printed pages too short. Consequently, I had to transpose a chapter from number 2 to number 1, and remodel number 2 altogether. This was the more unlucky, that it came upon me at the time when I was obliged to leave the book, in order to get up the readings the additional 12, for which Sir Thomas Watson's consent had been obtained, quite gone out of my mind since I left them off. However, I turned to it and got it done, and both numbers are now in type. Charles Collins has designed an excellent cover. It was his wish that his son-in-law should have illustrated the story, but this not being practicable, upon an opinion expressed by Mr. Millay, which the result thoroughly justified, choice was made of Mr. S. 50, Fildes. This reference to the last effort of Dickens's genius had been written as it thus stands, when a discovery of some interest was made by the writer. Within the leaves of one of Dickens's other manuscripts were found some detached slips of his writing, on paper only half the size of that used for the tale, so cramped, interlined, and blotted as to be nearly illegible, which on close inspection proved to be a scene in which Sapsy the auctioneer is introduced as the principal figure, among a group of characters new to the story. The explanation of it perhaps is that, having become a little nervous about the course of the tale, from a fear that he might have plunged too soon into the incidents leading on to the catastrophe, such as the Datchery assumption in the fifth number, a misgiving he had certainly expressed to his sister-in-law, it had occurred to him to open some fresh veins of character incidental to the interest, though not directly part of it, and so to handle them in connection with Sapsy, as a little to suspend the final development even while assisting to strengthen it. Before beginning any number of a serial he used, as we have seen in former instances, to plan briefly what he intended to put into it chapter by chapter, and his first number plan of Drood had the following: Mr. Sapsy, old Tory jackass, connect Jasper with him. He will want a solemn donkey by and by, which was effected by bringing together both Durdles and Jasper, for connection with Sapsy, in the matter of the epitaph for Mrs. Sapsy's tomb. The scene now discovered might, in this view, have been designed to strengthen and carry forward that element in the tale, and otherwise it very sufficiently expresses itself. It would supply an answer, if such were needed, to those who have asserted that the hopeless decadence of Dickens as a writer had set in before his death. Among the lines last written by him, these are the very last we can ever hope to receive, and they seem to me a delightful specimen of the power possessed by him in his prime, and the rarest which any novelist can have, of revealing a character by a touch. Here are a couple of people, Kimber and Peartree, not known to us before, whom we read off thoroughly in a dozen words. And as to Sapsy himself, auctioneer and mayor of Cloisterham, we are face to face with what before we only dimly realized, and we see the solemn jackass in his business pulpit, playing off the airs of Mr. Dean in his cathedral pulpit, with Cloisterham laughing at the impostor. How Mr. Sapsy ceased to be a member of the Eight Club, told by himself. Wishing to take the air, I proceeded by a circuitous route to the club, it being our weekly night of meeting. I found that we mustered our full strength. We were enrolled under the denomination of the Eight Club. We were 8 in number. We met at 8 o'clock during 8 months of the year. We played 8 games of four-handed cribbage at 8 pence the game. Our frugal supper was composed of 8 rolls, 8 mutton chops, 8 pork sausages, 8 baked potatoes, 8 marrow-bones with 8 toasts, and 8 bottles of ale. There may or may not be a certain harmony of color in the ruling idea of this, to adopt a phrase of our lively neighbors' reunion. It was a little idea of mine. A somewhat popular member of the Eight Club was a member by the name of Kimber, by profession, a dancing master. A commonplace, hopeful sort of man, wholly destitute of dignity or knowledge of the world. As I entered the clubroom, Kimber was making the remark, and he still half believes him to be very high in the church. In the act of hanging up my hat on the eighth peg by the door, I caught Kimber's visual ray. He lowered it and passed a remark on the next change of the moon. I did not take particular notice of this at the moment, because the world was often pleased to be a little shy of ecclesiastical topics in my presence. For I felt that I was picked out, though perhaps only through a coincidence to a certain extent, to represent what I call our glorious constitution in church and state. The phrase may be objected to by captious minds, but I own to it as mine. I threw it off in argument some little time back. I said, our glorious constitution in church and state. Another member of the Eight Club was Peartree, also member of the Royal College of Surgeons. Mr. Peartree is not accountable to me for his opinions, and I say no more of them here than that he attends the poor gratis whenever they want him, and is not the parish doctor. Mr. Peartree may justify it to the grasp of his mind, thus to do his republican utmost to bring an appointed officer into contempt. Suffice it that Mr. Peartree can never justify it to the grasp of mine. Between Peartree and Kimber there was a sickly sort of feeble-minded alliance. It came under my particular notice when I sold off Kimber by auction. Goods taken in execution. He was a widower in a white under-waistcoat and slight shoes with bows, and had two daughters not a-looking. Indeed the reverse. Both daughters taught dancing in scholastic establishments for young ladies had done so at Mrs. Sapsey's, nay, Twinkleton's, and both, in giving lessons, presented the unwomanly spectacle of having little fiddles tucked under their chins. In spite of which, the younger one might, if I am correctly informed, I will raise the veil so far as to say I know she might have soared for life from this degrading taint, but for having the class of mind allotted to what I call the common herd, and being so incredibly devoid of veneration as to become painfully ludicrous. When I sold off Kimber without reserve, Peartree, as poor as he can hold together, had several prime household lots knocked down to him. I am not to be blinded, and of course it was as plain to me what he was going to do with them, as it was that he was a brown hulking sort of revolutionary subject who had been in India with the soldiers, and ought for the sake of society to have his neck broke. I saw the lots shortly afterwards in Kimber's lodgings through the window, and I easily made out that there had been a sneaking pretense of lending them till better times. A man with a smaller knowledge of the world than myself might have been led to suspect that Kimber had held back money from his creditors and fraudulently bought the goods. But besides that I knew for certain he had no money, I knew that this would involve a species of forethought not to be made compatible with the frivolity of a caperer, inoculating other people with capering for his bread. As it was the first time I had seen either of those two since the sale, I kept myself in what I call abeyance. When selling him up, I had delivered a few remarks, shall I say a little homely, concerning Kimber, which the world did regard as more than usually worth notice. I had come up into my pulpit, it was said, uncommonly like, and a murmur of recognition had repeated his I will not name whose title before I spoke. I had then gone on to say that all present would find, in the first page of the catalogue that was lying before them, in the last paragraph before the first lot, the following words: sold in pursuance of a writ of execution issued by a creditor. I had then proceeded to remind my friends that however frivolous, not to say contemptible, the business by which a man got his goods together, still his goods were as dear to him, and as cheap to society if sold without reserve, as though his pursuits had been of a character that would bear serious contemplation. I had then divided my text, if I may be allowed so to call it, into three heads. Firstly, sold. Secondly, in pursuance of a writ of execution. Thirdly, issued by a creditor, with a few moral reflections on each, and winding up with, now to the first lot, in a manner that was complimented when I afterwards mingled with my hearers. So, not being certain on what terms I and Kimber stood, I was grave, I was chilling. Kimber, however, moving to me, I moved to Kimber. I was the creditor who had issued the writ, not that it matters. I was alluding, Mr. Sapsey, said Kimber, to a stranger who entered into conversation with me in the street as I came to the club. He had been speaking to you just before, it seemed, by the churchyard, and though you had told him who you were, I could hardly persuade him that you were not high in the church. Idiot, said Peartree. Ass, said Kimber. Idiot and ass, said the other 5 members. Idiot and ass, gentlemen, I remonstrated, looking around me, are strong expressions to apply to a young man of good appearance and address. My generosity was roused, I own it. You will admit that he must be a fool, said Peartree. You cannot deny that he must be a blockhead, said Kimber. Their tone of disgust amounted to being offensive. Why should the young man be so calumniated? What had he done? He had only made an innocent and natural mistake. I controlled my generous indignation and said so. Natural, repeated Kimber, he's a natural. The remaining 6 members of the 8 club laughed unanimously. It stung me, it was a scornful laugh. My anger was roused in behalf of an absent, friendless stranger. I rose for I had been sitting down. Gentlemen, I said with dignity, I will not remain one of this club, allowing opprobrium to be cast on an unoffending person in his absence. I will not so violate what I call the sacred rights of hospitality. Gentlemen, until you know how to behave yourselves better, I leave you. Gentlemen, until then I withdraw from this place of meeting, whatever personal qualifications I may have brought into it. Gentlemen, until then you cease to be the 8 club, and must make the best you can of becoming the 7. I put on my hat and retired. As I went downstairs, I distinctly heard them give a suppressed cheer. Such is the power of demeanor and knowledge of mankind. I had forced it out of them. 2. Whom should I meet in the street? Within a few yards of the door of the inn, where the club was held. But the self-same young man, whose cause I had felt it my duty so warmly and, I will add so disinterestedly take up. Is it Mr. Sapsea? He said doubtfully, or is it? It is Mr. Sapsea, I replied. Pardon me, Mr. Sapsea, you appear warm, sir. I have been warm, I said, and on your account. Having stated the circumstances at some length, my generosity almost overpowered him. I asked him his name. Mr. Sapsea, he answered, looking down, your penetration is so acute, your glance into the souls of your fellow men is so penetrating, that if I was hardy enough to deny that my name is Poker, what would it avail me? I do not know that I had quite exactly made out to a fraction that his name was Poker, but I dare say I had been pretty near doing it. Well, well, said I, trying to put him at his ease by nodding my head in a soothing way. Your name is Poker, and there is no harm in being named Poker. Oh, Mr. Sapsea, cried the young man in a very well-behaved manner, bless you for those words. He then, as if ashamed of having given way to his feelings, looked down again. Come, Poker, said I, let me hear more about you. Tell me, where are you going to, Poker, and where do you come from? Ah, Mr. Sapsea, exclaimed the young man, disguise from you is impossible. You know already that I come from somewhere and am going somewhere else. If I was to deny it, what would it avail me? Then do not deny it, was my remark. Or, pursued Poker, in a kind of despondent rapture, or if I was to deny that I came to this town to see and hear you, sir, what would it avail me? Or if I was to deny? The fragment ends there, and the hand that could alone have completed it is at rest forever. Some personal characteristics remain for illustration before the end is briefly told. Chapter 19, Personal Characteristics. 18,361,870. Dickens, not a bookish man character of his talk Dickens, made to tell his own story. Lord Russell, on Dickens's letters no self-conceit, in Dickens' letter, to his youngest son personal prayer hymn, in A Christmas Tale objection to posthumous honors source of quarrel, with literary fun small poets on. Royalty bargains editorship relations with contributors foreign views of English people editorial pleasures adverse, influences of periodical writing anger, and satire no desire to enter the House of Commons reforms, he took most interest in the Liverpool dinner in 1869 tribute to Lord Russell, the people. Governing and the people govern tone of last book alleged offers from the Queen's desire to see Dickens act Her Majesty's, wish to hear Dickens read interview with the Queen Dickens's grateful impression. From A Tin Memoriam by Arthur Helps Rural Enjoyment Say winner in the games Dickens's. Habits of life everywhere center and soul of his home daily habits London, Haunt's first attack of lameness how. It affected his large dogs his hatred, of indifference at social meetings agreeable pleasantries ghost stories marvels, of coincidence predominant impression of his life effects on his career. Objection has been taken to this biography as likely to disappoint its readers in not making them talk to Dickens, as Boswell makes them talk to Johnson. But where will the blame lie if a man takes up Pickwick and is disappointed to find that he is not reading Rasselas? A book must be judged for what it aims to be, and not for what it cannot by possibility be. I suppose so remarkable an author as Dickens hardly ever lived who carried so little of authorship into ordinary social intercourse. Potent as the sway of his writings was over him, it expressed itself in other ways. Traces or triumphs of literary labor, displays of conversational or other personal predominance, were no part of the influence he exerted over friends. To them, he was only the pleasantest of companions, with whom they forgot that he had ever written anything, and felt only the charm which a nature of such capacity for supreme enjoyment causes every one around it to enjoy. His talk was unaffected and natural, never bookish in the smallest degree. He was quite up to the average of well-read men, but as there was no ostentation of it in his writing, so neither was there in his conversation. This was so attractive because so keenly observant and lighted up with so many touches of humorous fancy, but with every possible thing to give relish to it, there were not many things to bring away. Of course, a book must stand or fall by its contents. Macaulay said very truly that the place of books in the public estimation is fixed, not by what is written about them, but by what is written in them. I offer no complaint of any remark made upon these volumes, but there have been some misapprehensions. Though Dickens bore outwardly so little of the impress of his writings, they formed the whole of that inner life which essentially constituted the man. And as in this respect he was actually, I have thought that his biography should endeavor to present him. The story of his books, therefore, at all stages of their progress, and of the hopes or designs connected with them, was my first care. With that view, and to give also to the memoir what was attainable of the value of autobiography, letters to myself, such as were never addressed to any other of his correspondents, and covering all the important incidents in the life to be retraced, were used with few exceptions exclusively. And though the exceptions are much more numerous in the present volume, this general plan has guided me to the end. Such were my limits indeed, that half even of those letters had to be put aside, and to have added all such others as were open to me would have doubled the size of my book, not contributed to it a new fact of life or character, and altered materially its design. It would have been so much lively illustration added to the subject, but out of place here. The purpose here was to make Dickens the sole central figure in the scenes revived, narrator as well as principal actor, and only by the means employed could consistency or unity be given to the self-revelation, and the picture made definite and clear. It is the peculiarity of few men to be to their most intimate friend neither more nor less than they are to themselves, but this was true of Dickens, and what kind or quality of nature such intercourse expressed in him, of what strength, tenderness, and delicacy susceptible, of what steady level warmth, of what daily unresting activity of intellect, of what unbroken continuity of kindly impulse through the change and vicissitude of 33 years, the letters to myself given in these volumes could alone express. Gathered from various and differing sources, their interest could not have been as the interest of these, in which everything comprised in the successive stages of a most attractive career is written with unexampled candor and truthfulness, and set forth in definite pictures of what he saw and stood in the midst of, unblurred by vagueness or reserve. Of the charge of obtruding myself to which their publication has exposed me, I can only say that I studied nothing so hard as to suppress my own personality, and have to regret my ill success, where I supposed I had even too perfectly succeeded. But we have all of us frequent occasion to say, parodying Mrs. Peacomb's remark, that we are bitter bad judges of ourselves. The other properties of these letters are quite subordinate to this main fact that the man who wrote them is thus perfectly seen in them, but they do not lessen the estimate of his genius. Admiration rises higher at the writer's mental forces, who, putting so much of himself into his work for the public, had still so much overflowing for such private intercourse. The sunny health of nature in them is manifest, its largeness, spontaneity, and manliness, but they have also that which highest intellects appreciate best. I have read them, Lord Russell wrote to me, with delight and pain. His heart, his imagination, his qualities of painting what is noble, and finding diamonds hidden far away, are greater here than even his works convey to me. How I lament he was not spared to us longer. I shall have a fresh grief when he dies in your volumes. Shall or people are more apt to find other things. If the bonhomie of a man's genius is obvious to all the world, there are plenty of knowing ones ready to take the shine out of the genius, to discover that after all it is not so wonderful, that what is grave in it wants depth, and the humor has something mechanical. But it will be difficult even for these to look over letters so marvelous in the art of reproducing to the sight what has once been seen, so natural and unstudied in their wit and fun, and with such a constant wellspring of sprightly runnings of speech. In them, point of epigram, ingenuity of quaint expression, absolute freedom from every touch of affectation, and to believe that the source of this man's humor, or of whatever gave wealth to his genius, was other than habitual, unbounded, and resistless. There is another consideration of some importance. Sterne did not more incessantly fall back from his works upon himself than Dickens did, and undoubtedly one of the impressions left by the letters is that of the intensity and tenacity with which he recognized, realized, contemplated, cultivated, and thoroughly enjoyed his own individuality in even its most trivial manifestations. But if anyone is led to ascribe this to self-esteem, to a narrow exclusiveness, or to any other invidious form of egotism, let him correct the impression by observing how Dickens bore himself amid the universal blazing-up of America, at the beginning and at the end of his career. Of his hearty, undisguised, and unmistakable enjoyment of his astonishing and indeed quite bewildering popularity, there can be as little doubt as that there is not a particle of vanity in it, any more than of false modesty or grimace. While realizing fully the fact of it, and the worth of the fact, there is not in his whole being a fiber that answers falsely to the charmer's voice. Few men in the world, one fancies, could have gone through such grand displays of fireworks, not merely with so marvelous an absence of what the French call pose, but unsoiled by the smoke of a cracker. No man's strong individuality was ever so free from conceit. Other personal incidents and habits, and especially some matters of opinion of grave importance, will help to make his character better known. Much questioning followed a brief former reference to his religious belief, but inconsistent or illogical as the conduct described may be, there is nothing to correct or to modify in my statement of it, and to what otherwise appeared to be in doubt, explicit answer will be afforded by a letter, written upon the youngest of his children leaving home in September 1868 to join his brother in Australia, than which none worthier appears in his story. I write this note today because your going away is much upon my mind, and because I want you to have a few parting words from me, to think of now and then at quiet times. I need not tell you that I love you dearly, and am very, very sorry in my heart to part with you. But this life is half made up of partings, and these pains must be borne. It is my comfort and my sincere conviction that you are going to try the life for which you are best fitted. I think its freedom and wildness more suited to you than any experiment in a study or office would have been, and without that training, you could have followed no other suitable occupation. What you have always wanted until now has been a set, steady, constant purpose. I therefore exhort you to persevere in a thorough determination to do whatever you have to do, as well as you can do it. I was not so old as you are now, when I first had to win my food, and to do it out of this determination, and I have never slackened in it since. Never take a mean advantage of anyone in any transaction, and never be hard upon people who are in your power. Try to do to others as you would have them do to you, and do not be discouraged if they fail sometimes. It is much better for you that they should fail in obeying the greatest rule laid down by our Savior than that you should. I put a New Testament among your books for the very same reasons, and with the very same hopes, that made me write an easy account of it for you, when you were a little child. Because it is the best book that ever was, or will be, known in the world, and because it teaches you the best lessons by which any human creature, who tries to be truthful and faithful to duty, can possibly be guided. As your brothers have gone away, one by one, I have written to each such words as I am now writing to you, and have entreated them all to guide themselves by this book, putting aside the interpretations and inventions of man. You will remember that you have never at home been harassed about religious observances or mere formalities. I have always been anxious not to weary my children with such things, before they are old enough to form opinions respecting them. You will therefore understand the better that I now most solemnly impress upon you the truth and beauty of the Christian religion, as it came from Christ himself, and the impossibility of your going far wrong if you humbly but heartily respect it. Only one thing more on this head. The more we are in earnest as to feeling it, the less we are disposed to hold forth about it. Never abandon the wholesome practice of saying your own private prayers, night and morning. I have never abandoned it myself, and I know the comfort of it. I hope you will always be able to say in afterlife that you had a kind father. You cannot show your affection for him so well or make him so happy as by doing your duty. They who most intimately knew Dickens will know best that every word there is written from his heart and is radiant with the truth of his nature. To the same effect in the leading matter, he expressed himself 12 years before, and again the day before his death, replying in both cases to correspondents who had addressed him as a public writer. A clergyman, the Rev. R.H. Davies, had been struck by the hymn in the Christmas tale of the wreck of the Golden Mary household words, 1856. I beg to thank you, Dickens, answered Christmas Eve, 1856, for your very acceptable letter, not the less gratifying to me, because I am myself the writer you refer to. There cannot be many men, I believe, who have a more humble veneration for the New Testament or a more profound conviction of its all-sufficiency than I have. If I am ever, as you tell me, I am mistaken on this subject, it is because I discountenance all obtrusive professions of and tradings in religion, as one of the main causes why real Christianity has been retarded in this world, and because my observation of life induces me to hold in unspeakable dread and horror those unseemly squabbles about the letter which drive the spirit out of hundreds of thousands. In precisely similar tone, to a reader of Edwin Drood Mr. J. 1000. Maychem, who had pointed out to him that his employment as a figure of speech of a line from Holy Writ in his 10th chapter might be subject to misconstruction, he wrote from Gad's Hill on Wednesday the 8th of June, 1870. It would be quite inconceivable to me, but for your letter, that any reasonable reader could possibly attach a scriptural reference to that passage. I am truly shocked to find that any reader can make the mistake. I have always striven in my writings to express veneration for the life and lessons of our Savior, because I feel it, and because I rewrote that history for my children, every one of whom knew it, from having it repeated to them, long before they could read, and almost as soon as they could speak. But I have never made proclamation of this from the housetops. A dislike of all display was rooted in him, and his objection to posthumous honors, illustrated by the instructions in his will, was very strikingly expressed 2 years before his death, when Mr. Thomas Fairbairn asked his help to a proposed recognition of Roger Brooke's services by a memorial in Westminster Abbey. I am very strongly impelled 24th of June, 1868, to comply with any request of yours. But these posthumous honors of committee, subscriptions, and Westminster Abbey are so profoundly unsatisfactory in my eyes that, plainly, I would rather have nothing to do with them in any case. My daughter and her aunt unite with me in kindest regards to Mrs. Fairbairn, and I hope you will believe in the possession of mine until I am quietly buried without any memorial, but such as I have set up in my lifetime. Asked a year later, August 1869, to say something on the inauguration of Leigh Hunt's bust at his grave in Kensal Green, he told the committee that he had a very strong objection to speech-making beside graves. I do not expect or wish my feelings in this wise to guide other men. Still, it is so serious with me, and the idea of ever being the subject of such a ceremony myself is so repugnant to my soul, that I must decline to officiate. His aversion to every form of what is called patronage of literature was part of the same feeling. A few months earlier, a Manchester gentleman wrote for his support to such a scheme. I beg to be excused, was his reply, from complying with the request you do me the honor to prefer, simply because I hold the opinion that there is a great deal too much patronage in England. The better the design, the less as I think should it seek such adventitious aid, and the more composedly should it rest on its own merits. This was the belief Southey held. It extended to the support by way of patronage given by such societies as the Literary Fund, which Southey also strongly resisted, and it survived the failure of the Guild, whereby it was hoped to establish a system of self-help, under which men engaged in literary pursuits might be as proud to receive as to give. Though there was no project of his life into which he flung himself with greater eagerness than the Guild, it was not taken up by the class it was meant to benefit, and every renewed exertion more largely added to the failure. There is no room in these pages for the story, which will add its chapter some day to the vanity of human wishes, but a passage from a letter to Bulwer Lytton at its outset will be some measure of the height from which the writer fell, when all hope for what he had so set his heart upon ceased. I do devoutly believe that this plan, carried by the support which I trust will be given to it, will change the status of the literary man in England, and make a revolution in his position which no government, no power on earth but his own, could ever affect. I have implicit confidence in the schemiso splendidly begunif, we carry it out with a steadfast energy. I have a strong conviction that we hold in our hands the peace and honor of men of letters for centuries to come, and that you are destined to be their best and most enduring benefactor. Oh, what a procession of new years may walk out of all this for the class we belong to, after we are dust. These views about patronage did not make him more indulgent to the clamor with which it is so often invoked for the ridiculously small. You read that Life of Clare? He wrote 15th of August, 1865. Did you ever see such preposterous exaggeration of small claims? And is not it expressive, the perpetual prating of him in the book as the poet? So another incompetent used to write to the literary fund when I was on the committee. This leaves the poet at his divine mission in a corner of the single room. The poet's father is wiping his spectacles. The poet's mother is weaving ya. He was equally intolerant of every magnificent proposal that should render the literary man independent of the bookseller, and he sharply criticized even a compromise to replace the half-profit system by one of royalties on copies sold. What does it come to? He remarked of an ably written pamphlet in which this was urged, 10th of November 1866. What is the worth of the remedy after all? You and I know very well that in 9 cases out of 10, the author is at a disadvantage with the publisher, because the publisher has capital and the author has not. We know perfectly well that in 9 cases out of 10 money is advanced by the publisher before the book is producibly often, long before. No young or unsuccessful author, unless he were an amateur and an independent gentleman, would make a bargain for having that royalty, tomorrow, if he could have a certain sum of money or an advance of money. The author who could command that bargain could command it tomorrow or command anything else. For the less fortunate or the less able, I make bold to say with some knowledge of the subject. As a writer who made a publisher's fortune long before he began to share in the real profits of his books, that if the publishers met next week, and resolved henceforth to make this royalty bargain, and no other, it would be an enormous hardship and misfortune, because the authors could not live while they wrote. The pamphlet seems to me just another example of the old philosophical chess playing, with human beings for pieces. Do not want money. Be careful to be born with means and have a banker's account. Your publisher will settle with you at such and such long periods according to the custom of his trade, and you will settle with your butcher and baker weekly in the meantime by drawing checks as I do. You must be sure not to want money, and then I have worked it out for you splendidly. Less has been said in this work than might perhaps have been wished, of the way in which his editorship of Household Words and All the Year Round was discharged. It was distinguished above all by liberality, and a scrupulous consideration and delicacy, evinced by him to all his contributors, was part of the esteem in which he held literature itself. It was said in a newspaper after his death, evidently by one of his contributors, that he always brought the best out of a man by encouragement and appreciation, that he liked his writers to feel unfettered, and that his last reply to a proposition for a series of articles had been, "Whatever you see your way to, I will see." Mine too, and we know and understand each other well enough to make the best of these conditions. Yet the strong feeling of personal responsibility was always present in his conduct of both journals, and varied as the contents of a number might be, and widely apart the writers, a certain individuality of his own was never absent. He took immense pains, as indeed was his habit, about everything with numbers in which he had written nothing, would often accept a paper from a young or unhandy contributor, because of some single notion in it which he thought it worth rewriting for, and in this way, or by helping generally to give strength and attractiveness to the work of others, he grudged no trouble. I have had a story he wrote 22nd of June, 1856, to hack and hew into some form for Household Words this morning, which has taken me 4 hours of close attention. And I am perfectly addled by its horrible want of continuity after all, and the dreadful spectacle I have made of the proofs which look like an inky fishing net. A few lines from another letter will show the difficulties in which he was often involved by the plan he adopted for Christmas numbers, of putting within a framework by himself a number of stories by separate writers to whom the leading notion had before been severally sent. As yet 25th of November 1859, not a story has come to me in the least belonging to the idea the simplest in the world, which I myself described in writing in the most elaborate manner, and every one of them turns, by a strange fatality, on a criminal trial. It had all to be set right by him, and editorship on such terms was not a sinecure. It had its pleasures as well as pains, however, and the greatest was when he fancied he could descry unusual merit in any writer. A letter will give one instance for illustration of many. The lady to whom it was addressed, admired under her assumed name of Home Lee, having placed it at my disposal. Folkestone, 14th of August 1855. I read your tale with the strongest emotion, and with a very exalted admiration of the great power displayed in it. Both in severity and tenderness I thought it masterly. It moved me more than I can express to you. I wrote to Mr. Wills that it had completely unsettled me for the day, and that by whomsoever it was written, I felt the highest respect for the mind that had produced it. It so happened that I had been for some days at work upon a character, externally like the ant, and it was very strange to me, indeed, to observe how the two people seemed to be near to one another at first, and then turned off on their own ways so wide asunder. I told Mr. Wills that I was not sure whether I could have prevailed upon myself to present to a large audience the terrible consideration of hereditary madness, when it was reasonably probable that there must be many or some among them whom it would awfully, because personally, address. But I was not obliged to ask myself the question, inasmuch as the length of the story rendered it unavailable for household words. I speak of its length in reference to that publication only. Relatively to what is told in it, I would not spare a page of your manuscript. Experience shows me that a story in 4 portions is best suited to the peculiar requirements of such a journal, and I assure you it will be an uncommon satisfaction to me if this correspondence should lead to your enrollment among its contributors. But my strong and sincere conviction of the vigor and pathos of this beautiful tale is quite apart from, and not to be influenced by, any ulterior results. You had no existence to me when I read it. The actions and sufferings of the characters affected me by their own force and truth, and left a profound impression on me. The experience there mentioned did not prevent him from admitting into his later periodical, all the year round, longer serial stories published with the names of known writers, and to his own interference with these he properly placed limits. When one of my literary brothers does me the honor to undertake such a task, I hold that he executes it on his own personal responsibility and for the sustainment of his own reputation, and I do not consider myself at liberty to exercise that control over his text which I claim as to other contributions, nor had he any greater pleasure, even in these cases, than to help younger novelists to popularity. You asked me about new writers last night. If you will read Kissing the Rod, a book one, have read today, you will not find it hard to take an interest in the author of such a book. That was Mr. Edmund Yates, in whose literary successes he took the greatest interest himself, and with whom he continued to the last an intimate personal intercourse which had dated from kindness shown at a very trying time. I think he wrote of another of his contributors, Mr. Percy Fitzgerald, for whom he had also much personal liking, and of whose powers he thought highly. You will find Fatal Zero a very curious bit of mental development, deepening as the story goes on into a picture not more startling than true. My mention of these pleasures of editorship shall close with what I think to him was the greatest. He gave to the world, while yet the name of the writer was unknown to him, the pure and pathetic verse of Adelaide Proctor. In the spring of the year 1853, I observed a short poem among the proffered contributions, very different, as I thought, from the shoal of verses perpetually setting through the office of such a periodical. The contributions had been large and frequent under an assumed name, when at Christmas 1854 he discovered that Miss Mary Barrick was the daughter of his old and dear friend Barry Cornwall. But periodical writing is not without its drawbacks, and its effect on Dickens, who engaged in it largely from time to time, was observable in the increased impatience of allusion to national institutions and conventional distinctions to be found in his later books. Party divisions he cared for less and less as life moved on, but the decisive, peremptory, dogmatic style, into which a habit of rapid remark on topics of the day will betray the most candid and considerate commentator, displayed its influence, perhaps not always consciously to himself, in the underlying tone of bitterness that runs through the books which followed Copperfield. The resentment against remediable wrongs is as praiseworthy in them as in the earlier tales, but the exposure of chancery abuses, administrative incompetence, politico-economic shortcomings, and social flunkeyism, in Bleak House, Little Dorrit, Hard Times, and Our Mutual Friend, would not have been made less odious by the cheerier tone that had struck with much sharper effect at prison abuses, parish wrongs, Yorkshire schools, and hypocritical humbug, in Pickwick, Oliver Twist, Nickleby, and Chuzzlewit. It will be remembered of him always that he desired to set right what was wrong, that he held no abuse to be unimprovable, that he left none of the evils named exactly as he found them, and that to influences drawn from his writings were due not a few of the salutary changes which marked the age in which he lived. But anger does not improve satire, and it gave latterly, from the causes named, too aggressive a form to what, after all, was but a very wholesome hatred of the cant that everything English is perfect, and that to call a thing un-English is to doom it to abhorred extinction. I have got an idea for occasional papers in household words called the Member for Nowhere. They will contain an account of his views, votes, and speeches, and I think of starting with his speeches on the Sunday question. He is a member of the government, of course. The moment they found such a member in the House, they felt that he must be dragged by force, if necessary, into the cabinet. I give it up reluctantly, he wrote afterwards, and with it my hope to have made every man in England feel something of the contempt for the House of Commons that I have. We shall never begin to do anything until the sentiment is universal. That was in August 1854, and the breakdown in the Crimea that winter much embittered his radicalism. I am hourly strengthened in my old belief, he wrote 3rd of February 1855, that our political aristocracy and our tough-thunting are the death of England. In all this business I do not see a gleam of hope. As to the popular spirit, it has come to be so entirely separated from the Parliament and government, and so perfectly apathetic about them both, that I seriously think it a most portentous sign. A couple of months later, I have rather a bright idea, I think, for household words this morning. A fine little bit of satire. An account of an Arabic Ms. lately discovered very like the Arabian Nights called The Thousand and One Humbugs, with new versions of the best-known stories. This also had to be given up, and is only mentioned as another illustration of his political discontents and of their connection with his journal work. The influences from his early life which unconsciously strengthened them in certain social directions has been hinted at, and of his absolute sincerity in the matter there can be no doubt. The mistakes of Dickens were never such as to cast a shade on his integrity. What he said with too much bitterness, in his heart he believed, and had, alas, too much ground for believing. Country, he wrote 27th of April 1855, which is discovered to be in this tremendous condition as to its war affairs, with an enormous black cloud of poverty in every town which is spreading and deepening every hour, and not one man in 2,000 knowing anything about, or even believing in, its existence, with a non-working aristocracy and a silent parliament, and everybody for himself and nobody for the rest. This is the prospect, and I think it a very deplorable one. Admirably did he say, of a notorious inquiry at that time, "Oh, what a fine aspect of political economy it is, that the noble professors of the science on the adulteration committee should have tried to make adulteration a question of supply and demand. We shall never get to the millennium, sir, by the rounds of that ladder. And I, for one, will not hold by the skirts of that great mogul of impostors, Master M. Culloch." Again, he wrote 30th of September 1855. I really am serious in thinking and I have given as painful consideration to the subject, as a man with children to live and suffer after him, can honestly give to it that representative government is become altogether a failure with us, that the English gentilities and subserviences render the people unfit for it, and that the whole thing has broken down since that great 17th century time, and has no hope in it. With the good sense that still overruled all his farthest extremes of opinion, he yet never thought of Parliament for himself. He could not mend matters, and for him, it would have been a false position. The people of the town of Reading and others applied to him during the first half of his life, and in the last half some of the metropolitan constituencies. To one of the latter, a reply is before me in which he says, "I declare that as to all matters on the face of this teeming earth, it appears to me that the House of Commons and Parliament altogether is become just the dreariest failure and nuisance that ever bothered this much bothered world." To a private inquiry of apparently about the same date he replied, "I have thoroughly satisfied myself, having often had occasion to consider the question, that I can be far more usefully and independently employed in my chosen sphere of action than I could hope to be in the House of Commons. And I believe that no consideration would induce me to become a member of that extraordinary assembly." Finally, upon a reported discussion in Finsbury, whether or not he should be invited to sit for that borough, He promptly wrote November 1861. It may save some trouble if you will kindly confirm a sensible gentleman who doubted at that meeting whether I was quite the man for Finsbury. I am not at all the sort of man, for I believe nothing would induce me to offer myself as a parliamentary representative of that place, or of any other under the sun. The only direct attempt to join a political agitation was his speech at Drury Lane for administrative reform, and he never repeated it. But every movement for practical social reforms, to obtain more efficient sanitary legislation, to get the best compulsory education practicable for the poor, and to better the condition of laboring people, he assisted earnestly to his last hour. And the readiness with which he took the chair at meetings having such objects in view, the help he gave to important societies working in beneficent ways for themselves or the community, and the power and attractiveness of his oratory, made him one of the forces of the time. His speeches derived singular charm from the buoyancy of his perfect self-possession, and to this he added the advantages of a person and manner which had become as familiar and as popular as his books. The most miscellaneous assemblages listened to him as to a personal friend. Two incidents at the close of his life will show what upon these matters his latest opinions were. At the great Liverpool dinner after his country readings in 1869, over which Lord Dufferin eloquently presided, he replied to a remonstrance from Lord Houghton against his objection to entering public life, that when he took literature for his profession, he intended it to be his sole profession, that at that time it did not appear to him to be so well understood in England, as in some other countries, that literature was a dignified profession by which any man might stand or fall, and he resolved that in his person at least it should stand by itself, of itself, and for itself, a bargain which no consideration on earth would now induce him to break. Here, however, he probably failed to see the entire meaning of Lord Houghton's regret, which would seem to have been meant to say, in more polite form, that to have taken some part in public affairs might have shown him the difficulty in a free state of providing remedies very swiftly for evils of long growth. A half-reproach from the same quarter for alleged unkindly sentiments to the House of Lords, he repelled with vehement warmth, insisting on his great regard for individual members, and declaring that there was no man in England he respected more in his public capacity, loved more in his private capacity, or from whom he had received more remarkable proofs of his honor and love of literature, than Lord Russell. In Birmingham shortly after, discoursing on education to the members of the Midland Institute, he told them they should value self-improvement not because it led to fortune, but because it was good and right in itself. Counseled them in regard to it that genius was not worth half so much as attention, or the art of taking an immense deal of pains, which he declared to be in every study and pursuit the one sole, safe, certain, remunerative quality, and summed up briefly his political belief. My faith in the people governing is, on the whole, infinitesimal. My faith in the people governed is, on the whole, illimitable. This he afterwards, January 1870, explained to mean that he had very little confidence in the people who govern us with a small p, and very great confidence in the people whom they govern with a large P. My confession being shortly and elliptically stated, was, with no evil intention I am absolutely sure, in some quarters inversely explained. He added that his political opinions had already been not obscurely stated in an idle book or two, and he reminded his hearers that he was the inventor of a certain fiction called the Circumlocution Office, said to be very extravagant, but which I do see rather frequently quoted as if there were grains of truth at the bottom of it. It may nevertheless be suspected, with some confidence, that the construction of his real meaning was not far wrong which assumed it as the condition precedent to his illimitable faith, that the people, even with the big P, should be governed. It was his constant complaint that, being much in want of government, they had only sham governors, and he had returned from his second American visit, as he came back from his first, indisposed to believe that the political problem had been solved in the land. Of the free, from the pages of his last book, the bitterness of allusion so frequent in the books just named was absent altogether, and his old, unaltered wish to better what was bad in English institutions carried with it no desire to replace them by new ones. In a memoir published shortly after his death, there appeared this statement: "For many years past, Her Majesty, the Queen has taken the liveliest interest in Mr. Dickens's literary labors, and has frequently expressed a desire for an interview with him. This interview took place on the 9th of April, when he received her commands to attend her at Buckingham Palace, and was introduced by his friend Mr. Arthur Helps, the clerk of the Privy Council. Since our author's decease, the journal with which he was formerly connected has said, the Queen was ready to confer any distinction which Mr. Dickens's known views and tastes would permit him to accept, and after more than one title of honor had been declined, Her Majesty desired that he would, at least, accept a place in her Privy Council. As nothing is too absurd for belief, it will not be superfluous to say that Dickens knew of no such desire on Her Majesty's part, and though all the probabilities are on the side of his unwillingness to accept any title or place of honor, certainly none was offered to him. It had been hoped to obtain Her Majesty's name for the Gerald performances in 1857, but, being a public effort in behalf of an individual, assent would have involved either perpetual compliance or the giving of perpetual offense. Her Majesty, however, then sent, through Colonel Phipps, a request to Dickens that he would select a room in the palace, do what he would with it, and let her see the play there. I said to call Phipps thereupon 21st of June, 1857, that the idea was not quite new to me, that I did not feel easy as to the social position of my daughters, 100, at a court under those circumstances, and that I would beg Her Majesty to excuse me if any other way of her seeing the play could be devised. To this Phipps said he had not thought of the objection, but had not the slightest doubt I was right. I then proposed that the Queen should come to the Gallery of Illustration a week before the subscription night, and should have the room entirely at her own disposal, and should invite her own company. This, with the good sense that seems to accompany her good nature on all occasions, she resolved within a few hours to do. The effect of the performance was a great gratification. My gracious sovereign, 5th of July, 1857, was so pleased that she sent round begging me to go and see her and accept her thanks. I replied that I was in my farce dress and must beg to be excused. Whereupon she sent again, saying that the dress could not be so ridiculous as that, and repeating the request. I sent my duty in reply, but again hoped Her Majesty would have the kindness to excuse my presenting myself in a costume and appearance that were not my own. I was mighty glad to think, when I woke this morning, that I had carried the point. The opportunity of presenting himself in his own costume did not arrive till the year of his death. Another effort, meanwhile, made having proved also unsuccessful. I was put into a state of much perplexity on Sunday, 30th of March, 1858. I do not know who had spoken to my informant, but it seems that the Queen is bent upon hearing the carol read, and has expressed her desire to bring it about without offense, hesitating about the manner of it, in consequence of my having begged to be excused from going to her when she sent for me after the frozen deep. I parried the thing as well as I could, but being asked to be prepared with a considerate and obliging answer, as it was known the request would be preferred, I said, well, I supposed call. Phipps would speak to me about it, and if it were he who did so, I should assure him of my desire to meet any wish of Her Majesty's, and should express my hope that she would indulge me by making one of some audience or other, for I thought an audience necessary to the effect. Thus it stands, but it bothers me. The difficulty was not surmounted, but Her Majesty's continued interest in the carol was shown by her purchase of a copy of it with Dickens's autograph at Thackeray's sale. And at last there came, in the year of his death, the interview with the author whose popularity dated from her accession, whose books had entertained larger numbers of her subjects than those of any other contemporary writer, and whose genius will be counted among the glories of her reign. Accident led to it. Dickens had brought with him from America some large and striking photographs of the battlefields of the Civil War, which the Queen, having heard of them through Mr. Helps, expressed a wish to look at. Dickens sent them at once, and went afterwards to Buckingham Palace with Mr. Helps, at Her Majesty's request, that she might see and thank him in person. It was in the middle of March, not April. "Come now, sir, this is an interesting matter, do favor us with it," was the cry of Johnson's friends after his conversation with George III. And again, the story was told to listeners ready to make marvels of its commonplaces. But the romance, even of the 18th century in such a matter, is clean gone out of the 19th. Suffice it that the Queen's kindness left a strong impression on Dickens. Upon Her Majesty's regret not to have heard his readings, Dickens intimated that they were become now a thing of the past, while he acknowledged gratefully Her Majesty's compliment in regard to them. She spoke to him of the impression made upon her by his acting in the frozen deep, and on his stating, in reply to her inquiry, that the little play had not been very successful on the public stage, said this did not surprise her, since it no longer had the advantage of his performance in it. Then arose a mention of some alleged discourtesy shown to Prince Arthur in New York, and he begged Her Majesty not to confound the true Americans of that city with the Fenian portion of its Irish population, on which she made the quiet comment that she was convinced the people about the prince had made too much of the affair. He related to her the story of President Lincoln's dream on the night before his murder. She asked him to give her his writings, and could she have them that afternoon? But he begged to be allowed to send a bound copy. Her Majesty then took from a table her own book upon the Highlands, with an autograph inscription to Charles Dickens, and, saying that the humblest of writers would be ashamed to offer it to one of the greatest, but that Mr. Helps, being asked to give it, had remarked that it would be valued most from herself, closed the interview by placing it in his hands. "Sir," said Johnson, "they may say what they like of the young king, but Louis XIV could not have shown a more refined courtliness, and Dickens was not disposed to say less of the young king's granddaughter. That the grateful impression sufficed to carry him into new ways, I had immediate proof, coupled with intimation of the still surviving strength of old memories. As my sovereign desires 26th of March 1870 that I should attend the next levee, do not faint with amazement if you see my name in that unwanted connection. I have scrupulously kept myself free for the 2nd of April, in case you should be accessible." The name appeared at the levee accordingly. His daughter was at the drawing room that followed, and Lady Houghton writes to me I never saw Mr. Dickens more agreeable than at a dinner at our house about a fortnight before his death, when he met the King of the Belgians and the Prince of Wales at the special desire of the latter. Up to nearly the hour of dinner, it was doubtful if he could go. He was suffering from the distress in his foot, and on arrival at the house, being unable to ascend the stairs, had to be assisted at once into the dining room. The friend who had accompanied Dickens to Buckingham Palace, writing of him after his death, briefly but with admirable knowledge and taste, said that he ardently desired, and confidently looked forward to, a time when there would be a more intimate union than exists at present between the different classes in the state, a union that should embrace alike the highest and the lowest. This perhaps expresses, as well as a few words could, what certainly was always at his heart, and he might have come to think it when his life was closing, more possible of realization some day than he ever thought it before. The hope of it was on his friend Talfourd's lips when he died, and his own most jarring opinions might at last have joined in the effort to bring about such reconcilement. More on this head it needs not to say. Whatever may be the objection to special views held by him, he would, wanting even the most objectionable, have been less himself. It was by something of the despot seldom separable from genius, joined to a truthfulness of nature belonging to the highest characters, that men themselves of a rare faculty were attracted to find in Dickens what Sir Arthur Helps has described, a man to confide in, and look up to as a leader, in the midst of any great peril. Mr. Layard also held that opinion of him. He was at Gad's Hill during the Christmas before Dickens went for the last time to America, and witnessed one of those scenes, not infrequent there, in which the master of the house was preeminently at home. They took generally the form of cricket matches, but this was, to use the phrase of his friend Bobadil, more popular and diffused, and of course he rose with the occasion. "The more you want of the master, the more you will find in him," said the gasman employed about his readings. "Footraces for the villagers," he wrote on Christmas Day, "come off in my field tomorrow. We have been all hard at work all day, building a course, making countless flags, and I do not know what else." Layard is chief commissioner of the domestic police. The country police predict an immense crowd. There were between 2,000 and 3,000 people. And somehow, by a magical kind of influence, said Layard, Dickens seemed to have bound every creature present, upon what honor the creature had to keep order. What was the special means used, or the art employed, it might have been difficult to say, but that was the result. Writing on New Year's Day, Dickens himself described it to me. We had made a very pretty course, and taken great pains. Encouraged by the cricket match's experience, I allowed the landlord of the Falstaff to have a drinking booth on the ground. Not to seem to dictate or distrust, I gave all the prizes about £10 in the aggregate in money. The great mass of the crowd were laboring men of all kinds, soldiers, sailors, and navvies. They did not, between 10:30, when we began, and sunset, displace a rope or a stake, and they left every barrier and flag as neat as they found it. There was not a dispute, and there was no drunkenness whatever. I made them a little speech from the lawn at the end of the games, saying that please God we would do it again next year. They cheered most lustily and dispersed. The road between this and Chatham was like a fair all day, and surely it is a fine thing to get such perfect behavior out of a reckless seaport town. Among other oddities, we had a hurdle race for strangers. One man he came in second ran 120 yards and leaped over 10 hurdles in 20 seconds with a pipe in his mouth and smoking it all the time. If it had not been for your pipe, I said to him at the winning post, you would have been first. I beg your pardon, sir, he answered, but if it had not been for my pipe, I should have been nowhere. The close of the letter had this rather memorable announcement. The sale of the Christmas number was, yesterday evening, 255,380. Would it be absurd to say that there is something in such a vast popularity in itself electrical, and though founded on books, felt where books never reach? It is also very noticeable that what would have constituted the strength of Dickens if he had entered public life, the attractive as well as the commanding side of his nature, was that which kept him most within the circle of home pursuits and enjoyments. This better part of him had now long survived that sorrowful period of 18,578, when, for reasons which I have not thought myself free to suppress, a vaguely disturbed feeling for the time took possession of him, and occurrences led to his adoption of other pursuits than those to which, till then he had given himself exclusively. It was a sad interval in his life, but though changes incident to the new occupation then taken up remained, and with them many adverse influences which brought his life prematurely to a close, it was, with any reference to that feeling, an interval only, and the dominant impression of the later years, as of the earlier, takes the marvelously domestic home-loving shape in which also the strength of his genius is found. It will not do to draw around any part of such a man too hard a line, and the writer must not be charged with inconsistency who says that Dickens's childish sufferings, and the sense they burnt into him of the misery of loneliness and a craving for joys of home, though they led to what was weakest in him, led also to what was greatest. It was his defect as well as his merit in maturer life not to be able to live alone. When the fancies of his novels were upon him, and he was under their restless influence, though he often talked of shutting himself up in out-of-the-way solitary places, he never went anywhere unaccompanied by members of his family. His habits of daily life he carried with him wherever he went. In Albero and Genoa, at Lausanne and Geneva, in Paris and Boulogne, his ways were as entirely those of home as in London and Broadstairs. If it is the property of a domestic nature to be personally interested in every detail, the smallest as the greatest, of the four walls within which one lives, then no man had it so essentially as Dickens. No man was so inclined naturally to derive his happiness from home concerns. Even the kind of interest in a house which is commonly confined to women, he was full of. Not to speak of changes of importance, there was not an additional hook put up wherever he inhabited, without his knowledge, or otherwise than as part of some small ingenuity of his own. Nothing was too minute for his personal superintendence. Whatever might be in hand, theatricals for the little children, entertainments for those of larger growth, cricket matches, dinners, field sports, from the first New Year's Eve dance in Doughty Street to the last musical party in Hyde Park Place, he was the center and soul of it. He did not care to take measure of its greater or less importance. It was enough that a thing was to do, to be worth his while to do it as if there was nothing else to be done in the world. The cry of laud and Wentworth was his, alike in small and great things, and to no man was more applicable the German ect, which expresses reality as well as thoroughness. The usual result followed in all his homes of an absolute reliance on him for everything. Under every difficulty and in every emergency, his was the encouraging influence, the bright and ready help. In illness, whether of the children or any of the servants, he was better than a doctor. He was so full of resource, for which every one eagerly turned to him, that his mere presence in the sick room was a healing influence, as if nothing could fail if he were only there. So that at last, when, all through the awful night which preceded his departure, he lay senseless in the room where he had fallen, the stricken and bewildered ones who tended him found it impossible to believe that what they saw before them alone was left, or to shut out wholly the strange wild hope that he might again be suddenly among them like himself, and revive what they could not connect, even then, with death's despairing helplessness. It was not a feeling confined to the relatives whom he had thus taught to have such exclusive dependence on him. Among the consolations addressed to those mourners came words from one whom in life he had most honored, and who also found it difficult to connect him with death, or to think that he should never see that blithe face any more. It is almost 30 years, Mr. Carlyle wrote, since my acquaintance with him began, and on my side, I may say, every new meeting ripened it into more and more clear discernment of his rare and great worth as a brother man. A most cordial, sincere, clear-sighted, quietly decisive, just and loving man, till at length he had grown to such a recognition with me as I have rarely had for any man of my time. This I can tell you three, for it is true and will be welcome to you. To others less concerned I had as soon not speak on such a subject. I am profoundly sorry for you, Mr. Carlyle at the same time wrote to me, and indeed for myself and for us all. It is an event worldwide, a unique of talents suddenly extinct, and has eclipsed, we too may say, the harmless gaiety of nations. No death since 1866 has fallen on me with such a stroke. No literary man's hitherto ever 999. The good, the gentle, high-gifted, ever-friendly, noble Dickens, every inch of him an honest man. Of his ordinary habits of activity I have spoken, and they were doubtless carried too far. In youth it was all well, but he did not make allowance for years. This has had abundant illustration, but will admit of a few words more. To all men who do much, rule and order are essential. Method in everything was Dickens's peculiarity, and between breakfast and luncheon, with rare exceptions, was his time of work. But his daily walks were less of rule than of enjoyment and necessity. In the midst of his writing they were indispensable, and especially, as it has often been shown, at night. Mr. Sala is an authority on London streets, and in the eloquent and generous tribute he was among the first to offer to his memory, has described himself encountering Dickens in the oddest places and most inclement weather, in Ratcliffe Highway on Haverstock Hill on Camberwell Green, in Grayson Lane in the Wandsworth Road, at Hammersmith Broadway in Norton Falgate, and at Kensal New Town. A handsome whirled you by the bell and horns at Brompton, and there he was striding, as with seven-legged boots, seemingly in the direction of North End, Fulham. The Metropolitan Railway sent you forth at Lisson Grove, and you met him plodding speedily towards the Yorkshire Stingo. He was to be met rapidly skirting the grim brick wall of the prison in Coldbath Fields, or trudging along the Seven Sisters Road at Holloway, or bearing, under a steady press of sail, underneath Highgate Archway, or pursuing the even tenor of his way up the Vauxhall Bridge Road. But he was equally at home in the intricate byways of narrow streets and in the lengthy thoroughfares. Wherever there was matter to be heard and learned, in back streets behind Holborn, in borough courts and passages, in city wharfs or alleys about the poorer lodging houses, in prisons, workhouses, ragged schools, police courts, rag shops, chandlers' shops, and all sorts of markets for the poor, he carried his keen observation and untiring study. I was among the Italian boys from 12 to 2 this morning, says one of his letters. I am going out tonight in their boat with the Thames police, says another. It was the same when he was in Italy or Switzerland, as we have seen, and when, in later life, he was in French provincial places. I walk miles away into the country, and you can scarcely imagine by what deserted ramparts and silent little cathedral closes, or how I pass over rusty drawbridges and stagnant ditches out of and into the decaying town. For several consecutive years, I accompanied him every Christmas Eve to see the marketings for Christmas down the road from Aldgate to Bow, and he had a surprising fondness for wandering about in poor neighborhoods on Christmas Day, past the areas of shabby genteel houses in Somers or Kentish towns, and watching the dinners preparing or coming in. But the temptations of his country life led him on to excesses in walking. Coming in just now, he wrote in his third year at Gadshill, after 12 miles in the rain, I was so wet that I have had to change and get my feet into warm water before I could do anything. Again, 2 years later, a southeaster blowing, enough to cut one's throat. I am keeping the house for my cold, as I did yesterday. But the remedy is so new to me that I doubt if it does me half the good of a dozen miles in the snow. So, if this mode of treatment fails today, I shall try that tomorrow. He tried it perhaps too often. In the winter of 1865, he first had the attack in his left foot, which materially disabled his walking power for the rest of his life. He supposed its cause to be overwalking in the snow, and that this had aggravated the suffering is very likely. But, read by the light of what followed, it may now be presumed to have had more serious origin. It recurred at intervals before America, without any such provocation. In America it came back, not when he had most been walking in the snow, but when nervous exhaustion was at its worst with him. After America, it became prominent on the eve of the occurrence at Preston which first revealed the progress that disease had been making in the vessels of the brain. And in the last year of his life, as will immediately be seen, It was a constant trouble and most intense suffering, extending then gravely to his left hand also, which had before been only slightly affected. It was from a letter of the 21st of February, 1865, I first learnt that he was suffering tortures from a frostbitten foot, and 10 days later brought more detailed account. I got frostbitten by walking continually in the snow and getting wet in the feet daily. My boots hardened and softened, my left foot swelled, and I still forced the boot on. Sat in it to write, half the day, walked in it through the snow, the other half, forced the boot on again next morning, sat and walked again, and being accustomed to all sorts of changes in my feet, took no heed. At length, going out as usual, I fell lame on the walk and had to limp home dead lame, through the snow, for the last 3 miles the remarkable terror, by the by, of the two big dogs. The dogs were Turk and Linda. Boisterous companions as they always were, the sudden change in him brought them to a standstill, and for the rest of the journey they crept by the side of their master as slowly as he did, never turning from him. He was greatly moved by the circumstance, and often referred to it. Turk's look upward to his face was one of sympathy as well as fear, he said, but Linda was wholly struck down. The saying in his letter to his youngest son that he was to do to others what he would that they should do to him, without being discouraged if they did not do it. And his saying to the Birmingham people that they were to attend to self-improvement, not because it led to fortune, but because it was right, express a principle that at all times guided himself. Capable of strong attachments, he was not what is called an effusive man, but he had no half-heartedness in any of his likings. The one thing entirely hateful to him was indifference. I give my heart to very few people, but I would sooner love the most implacable man in the world than a careless one, who, if my place were empty tomorrow, would rub on and never miss me. There was nothing he more repeatedly told his children than that they were not to let indifference in others appear to justify it in themselves. All kind things, he wrote, must be done on their own account, and for their own sake, and without the least reference to any gratitude. Again he laid it down, while he was making some exertion for the sake of a dead friend that did not seem likely to win proper appreciation from those it was to serve. As to gratitude from the family, as I have often remarked to you, one does a generous thing because it is right and pleasant, and not for any response it is to awaken in others. The rule in another form frequently appears in his letters, and it was enforced in many ways upon all who were dear to him. It is worthwhile to add his comment on a regret of a member of his family at an act of self-devotion supposed to have been thrown away. Nothing of what is nobly done can ever be lost. It is also to be noted as in the same spirit that it was not the loud but the silent heroisms he most admired. Of Sir John Richardson, one of the few who have lived in our days entitled to the name of a hero, he wrote from Paris in 1856. Lady Franklin sent me the whole of that Richardson memoir, and I think Richardson's manly friendship and love of Franklin one of the noblest things I ever knew in my life. It makes one's heart beat high with a sort of sacred joy. It is the feeling as strongly awakened by the earlier exploits of the same gallant man to be found at the end of Franklin's first voyage, and never to be read without the most exalted emotion. It was for something higher than mere literature, he valued the most original writer and powerful teacher of the age. I would go at all times farther to see Carlyle than any man alive. Of his attractive points in society and conversation I have particularized little, because in truth they were himself. Such as they were never absent from him. His acute sense of enjoyment gave such relish to his social qualities that probably no man, not a great wit or a professed talker, ever left, in leaving any social gathering, a blank so impossible to fill up. In quick and varied sympathy, in ready adaptation to every whim or humor, in help to any mirth or game, he stood for a dozen men. If one may say such a thing, he seemed to be always the more himself for being somebody else, for continually putting off his personality. His versatility made him unique. What he said once of his own love of acting applied to him equally when at his happiest among friends he loved. Sketching a character, telling a story, acting a charade, taking part in a game, turning into comedy an incident of the day, describing the last good or bad thing he had seen, reproducing in quaint, tragical, or humorous form and figure some part of the passionate life with which all his being overflowed. Assumption has charms for me so delightful I hardly know for how many wild reasons that I feel a loss of I cannot say what exquisite foolery, when I lose a chance of being some one not in the remotest degree like myself. how it was that, from one of such boundless resource in contributing to the pleasure of his friends, there was yet, as I have said, so comparatively little to bring away, may be thus explained. But it has been also seen that no one at times said better things, and to happy examples formerly given, I will add one or two of a kind he more rarely indulged. He is below par on the exchange, a friend remarked of a notorious puffing actor. He does not stand well at Lloyd's. Yet no one stands so well with the underwriters, said Dickens, a pun that Swift would have envied. I call him an incubus, said a non-literary friend, at a loss to express the boredom inflicted on him by a popular author. Pen and incubus, you mean, interposed Dickens. So when Stanfield said of his midshipman's son, then absent on his first cruise, the boy has got his sea legs on by this time. I do not know, remarked Dickens, about his getting his sea legs on, but if I may judge from his writing, he certainly has not got his ABC legs on. Other agreeable pleasantries might be largely cited from his letters. An old priest he wrote from France in 1862, the express image of Frederick Lemaître got up for the part, and very cross with the toothache, told me in a railway carriage the other day that we had no antiquities in heretical England. None at all, I said. You have some ships, however. Yes, a few. Are they strong? Well, said I, your trade is spiritual, my father. Ask the ghost of Nelson. A French captain who was in the carriage was immensely delighted with this small joke. I met him at Calais yesterday going somewhere with a detachment, and he said pardon. But he had been so limited as to suppose an Englishman incapable of that bonhomie. In humoring a joke, he was excellent, both in letters and talk, and for this kind of enjoyment, his least important little notes are often worth preserving. Take one small instance. So freely had he admired a tale told by his friend and solicitor Mr. Frederick Ouvry, that he had to reply to a humorous proposal for publication of it, in his own manner, in his own periodical. Your modesty is equal to your merit. I think your way of describing that rustic courtship in middle life quite matchless. A check for 1,000 is lying with the publisher. We would willingly make it more, but that we find our law charges so exceedingly heavy. His letters have also examples, now and then, of what he called his conversational triumphs. I have distinguished myself 28th of April 1861 in two respects lately. I took a young lady, unknown, down to dinner, and talking to her about the Bishop of Durham's nepotism in the matter of Mr. Cheese, I found she was Mrs. Cheese. And I expatiated to the member for Marylebone, Lord Fermor, generally conceiving him to be an Irish member, on the contemptible character of the Marylebone constituency and Marylebone representation. Among his good things should not be omitted his telling of a ghost story. He had something of a hankering after them, as the readers of his briefer pieces will know, and such was his interest generally in things supernatural that, but for the strong restraining power of his common sense, he might have fallen into the follies of spiritualism. As it was, the fanciful side of his nature stopped short at such pardonable superstitions as those of dreams, and lucky days, or other marvels of natural coincidence. And no man was readier to apply sharp tests to a ghost story or a haunted house, though there was just so much tendency to believe in any such, well authenticated, as made perfect his manner of telling one. Such a story is related in the 125th number of All the Year Round, which before its publication, both Mr. Layard and myself saw at Gadshill, and identified as one related by Lord Lytton. It was published in September, and in a day or two led to what Dickens will relate. The artist himself, who is the hero of that story to Lord Lytton, 15th of September 1861, has sent me in black and white his own account of the whole experience. So very original, so very extraordinary, so very far beyond the version I have published, that all other like stories turn pale before it. The Ghost thus reinforced came out in the number published on the 5th of October, and the reader who cares to turn to it and compare what Dickens in the interval 17th of September wrote to myself will have some measure of his readiness to believe in such things. Upon the publication of the ghost story, up has started the portrait painter who saw the phantoms. His own written story is out of all distance the most extraordinary that ever was produced, and is as far beyond my version or Bulwer's as Scott is beyond James. Everything connected with it is amazing. But conceive this portrait painter had been engaged to write it elsewhere as a story for next Christmas, and not unnaturally supposed, when he saw himself anticipated in All the Year Round, that there had been treachery at his printers. In particular, says he, how else was it possible that the date, the 13th of September, could have been got at? For I never told the date until I wrote it. Now my story had no date, but seeing, when I looked over the proof, the great importance of having a date, I 500 wrote in, unconsciously, the exact date on the margin of the proof. The reader will remember the Doncaster race story, and to other like illustrations of the subject already given, may be added this dream. Here is a curious case at first-hand 30th of May 1863. On Thursday night and last week, being at the office here, I dreamed that I saw a lady in a red shawl with her back towards me whom I supposed to be. On her turning round I found that I did not know her, and she said I am Miss Napier. All the time I was dressing next morning, I thought what a preposterous thing to have so very distinct a dream about nothing. And why Miss Napier? For I never heard of any Miss Napier. That same Friday night I read. After the reading, came into my retiring room, Mary Boyle and her brother, and the lady in the red shawl whom they present as Miss Napier. These are all the circumstances, exactly told. Another kind of dream has had previous record, with no superstition to build itself upon but the loving devotion to one tender memory. With longer or shorter intervals, this was with him all his days. Never from his waking thoughts was the recollection altogether absent, and though the dream would leave him for a time, it unfailingly came back. It was the feeling of his life that always had a mastery over him. What he said on the 6th anniversary of the death of his sister-in-law, that friend of his youth whom he had made his ideal of all moral excellence, he might have said as truly after 26 years more. In the very year before he died, the influence was potently upon him. She is so much in my thoughts at all times, especially when I am successful and have greatly prospered in anything, that the recollection of her is an essential part of my being, and is as inseparable from my existence as the beating of my heart is. Through later troubled years, whatever was worthiest in him found in this an ark of safety, and it was the nobler part of his being which had thus become also the essential. It gave to success what success by itself had no power to give, and nothing could consist with it, for any length of time, that was not of good report and pure. What more could I say that was not better said from the pulpit of the abbey where he rests? He whom we mourn was the friend of mankind, a philanthropist in the true sense, the friend of youth, the friend of the poor, the enemy of every form of meanness and oppression. I am not going to attempt to draw a portrait of him. Men of genius are different from what we suppose them to be. They have greater pleasures and greater pains, greater affections and greater temptations than the generality of mankind, and they can never be altogether understood by their fellow men. But we feel that a light has gone out, that the world is darker to us when they depart. There are so very few of them that we cannot afford to lose them one by one, and we look vainly round for others who may supply their places. He whose loss we now mourn occupied a greater space than any other writer in the minds of Englishmen during the last 33 years. We read him, talked about him, acted him. We laughed with him. We were roused by him to a consciousness of the misery of others and to a pathetic interest in human life. Works of fiction, indirectly, are great instructors of this world, and we can hardly exaggerate the debt of gratitude which is due to a writer who has led us to sympathize with these good, true, sincere, honest English characters of ordinary life, and to laugh at the egotism, the hypocrisy, the false respectability of religious professors and others. To another great humorist who lies in this church, the words have been applied that his death eclipsed the gaiety of nations. But of him who has been recently taken, I would rather say, in humbler language, that no one was ever so much beloved or so much mourned. Chapter 20, The End. 18,690,1870. Visit from Mr. and Mrs. Field's places shown to visitor last paper in all the year, Roundson Henry's scholarship reading of Edwin, drewed medical attendance at reading's excitement, after Oliver Twist scene's farewell address results of over-excitement last appearances, in public death of Daniel. Maclay's Temptations of London another attack, in the footnote-worthy incident tribute of gratitude, for his book's last letter, from him last day's thoughts, on his last day of consciousness the close general mourning wish, to bury him in the abbey his own wish the burial unbidden mourners the grave. The summer and autumn of 1869 were passed quietly at Gad's Hill. He received there, in June, the American friends to whom he had been most indebted for unwearying domestic kindness at his most trying time in the States. In August, he was at the dinner of the International Boat Race, and, in a speech that might have gone far to reconcile the victors to changing places with the vanquished, gave the healths of the Harvard and the Oxford crews. He went to Birmingham in September to fulfill a promise that he would open the session of the Institute. And there, after telling his audience that his invention, such as it was, never would have served him as it had done, but for the habit of commonplace, patient, drudging attention, he declared his political creed to be infinitesimal faith in the people governing and illimitable faith in the people governed. In such engagements as these, with nothing of the kind of strain he had most to dread, there was hardly more movement or change than was necessary to his enjoyment of rest. He had been able to show Mr. Field something of the interest of London, as well as of his Kentish home. He went over its general post office with him, took him among its cheap theatres and poor lodging houses, and piloted him by night through its most notorious thieves' quarter. Its localities that are pleasantest to a lover of books, such as Johnson's Bolt Court and Goldsmith's Temple Chambers, he explored with him, and, at his visitor's special request, mounted a staircase he had not ascended for more than 30 years, to show the chambers in Furnivall's Inn where the first page of Pickwick was written. One more book, unfinished, was to close what that famous book began, and the original of the scene of its opening chapter, the opium eater's den, was the last place visited. In a miserable court at night, says Mr. Fields, we found a haggard old woman blowing at a kind of pipe made of an old ink bottle, and the words which Dickens puts into the mouth of this wretched creature in Edwin Drood, we heard her croon as we leaned over the tattered bed in which she was lying. Before beginning his novel, he had written his last paper for his weekly publication. It was a notice of my life of Landor, and contained some interesting recollections of that remarkable man. His memory at this time dwelt much, as was only natural, with past pleasant time, as he saw familiar faces leaving us or likely to leave. And on the death of one of the comedians associated with the old bright days of Covent Garden, I had intimation of a fancy that had never quitted him since the Cheltenham reading. I see in the paper today that Meadows is dead. I had a talk with him at Couts's a week or two ago, when he said he was 75 and very weak. Except for having a tearful eye, he looked just the same as ever. My mind still constantly misgives me concerning Macready. Curiously, I do not think he has been ever, for 10 minutes together, out of my thoughts since I talked with Meadows last. Well, the year that brings trouble brings comfort too. I have a great success in the boy line to announce to you. Harry has won the second scholarship at Trinity Hall, which gives him 50 a year as long as he stays there, and I begin to hope that he will get a fellowship. I doubt if anything ever more truly pleased him than this little success of his son Henry at Cambridge. Henry missed the fellowship, but was 29th Wrangler in a fair year, when the Wranglers were over 40. He finished his first number of Edwin Drood in the third week of October, and on the 26th read it at my house with great spirit. A few nights before we had seen together at the Olympic a little drama taken from his Copperfield, which he sat out with more than patience, even with something of enjoyment, and another pleasure was given him that night by its author, Mr. Halliday, who brought into the box another dramatist, Mr. Robertson, to whom Dickens, who then first saw him, said that to himself the charm of his little comedies was their unassuming form, which had so happily shown that real wit could afford to put off any airs of pretension to it. He was at Gad's Hill till the close of the year, coming up for a few special occasions, such as Proctor's Aidiscon birthday, and at my house on New Year's Eve he read to us, again aloud, a fresh number of his book. Yet these very last days of December had not been without a reminder of the grave warnings of April. The pains in somewhat modified form had returned in both his left hand and his left foot a few days before we met, and they were troubling him still on that day. But he made so light of them himself, so little thought of connecting them with the uncertainties of touch and tread of which they were really part, and read with such an overflow of humor Mr. Honeythunder's boisterous philanthropy, that there was no room, then, for anything but enjoyment. His only allusion to an effect from his illness was his mention of a now invincible dislike which he had to railway travel. This had decided him to take a London house for the 12 last readings in the early months of 1870, and he had become Mr. Milner Gibson's tenant at 5, Hyde Park Place. St. James's Hall was to be the scene of these readings, and they were to occupy the interval from the 11th of January to the 15th of March, 2 being given in each week to the close of January, and the remaining 8 on each of the 8 Tuesdays following. Nothing was said of any kind of apprehension as the time approached, but with a curious absence of the sense of danger, there was certainly both distrust and fear. Sufficient precaution was supposed to have been taken by arrangement for the presence, at each reading, of his friend and medical attendant, Mr. Carr Beard, but this resolved itself, not into any measure of safety, the case admitting of none short of stopping the reading altogether, but simply into ascertainment of the exact amount of strain and pressure, which, with every fresh exertion, he was placing on those vessels of the brain, where the Preston trouble too surely had revealed that danger lay. No supposed force in reserve, no dominant strength of will, can turn aside the penalties sternly exacted for disregard of such laws of life as were here plainly overlooked. And though no one may say that it was not already too late for any but the fatal issue, there will be no presumption in believing that life might yet have been for some time prolonged if these readings could have been stopped. I am a little shaken, he wrote on the 9th of January, by my journey to Birmingham to give away the institution's prizes on Twelfth Night, but I am in good heart, and notwithstanding Lowe's worrying scheme for collecting a year's taxes in a lump, which they tell me is damaging books, pictures, music, and theaters beyond precedent, our let at St. James's Hall is enormous. He opened with Copperfield and the Pickwick trial, and I may briefly mention, from the notes taken by Mr. Beard and placed at my disposal, at what cost of exertion to himself he gratified the crowded audiences that then, and to the close, made these evenings memorable. His ordinary pulse on the first night was at 72, but never on any subsequent night was lower than 82, and had risen on the later nights to more than 100. After Copperfield on the first night, it went up to 96, and after Marigold on the second to 99. But on the first night of the Sykes and Nancy scenes, Friday the 21st of January, it went from 80 to 112, and on the second night, the 1st of February, to 118. From this, through the 6 remaining nights, it never was lower than 110 after the first piece read. And after the third and fourth readings of the Oliver Twist scenes it rose, from 90 to 124 on the 15th of February, and from 94 to 120 on the 8th of March, on the former occasion after 20 minutes rest, falling to 98, and on the latter, after 15 minutes rest, falling to 82. His ordinary pulse on entering the room during these last 6 nights was more than once over 100 and never lower than 84, from which it rose, after Nickleby on the 22nd of February, to 112. On the 8th of February, when he read Dami, it had risen from 91 to 114. On the 1st of March, after Copperfield, it rose from 100 to 124, and when he entered the room on the last night it was at 108, having risen only 2 beats more when the reading was done. The pieces on this occasion were the Christmas Carol, followed by the Pickwick Trial, and probably in all his life he never read so well. On his return from the States, where he had to address his effects to audiences composed of immense numbers of people, a certain loss of refinement had been observable, but the old delicacy was now again delightfully manifest, and a subdued tone, as well in the humorous as the serious portions, gave something to all the reading as of a quiet sadness of farewell. The charm of this was at its height when he shut the volume of Pickwick and spoke in his own person. He said that for 15 years he had been reading his own books to audiences whose sensitive and kindly recognition of them had given him instruction and enjoyment in his art, such as few men could have had, but that he nevertheless thought it well now to retire upon older associations, and in future to devote himself exclusively to the calling which had first made him known. In but 2 short weeks from this time, I hope that you may enter, in your own homes, on a new series of readings at which my assistance will be indispensable. But from these garish lights I vanish now forevermore, with a heartfelt, grateful, respectful, affectionate farewell. The brief hush of silence as he moved from the platform, and the prolonged tumult of sound that followed suddenly, stayed him, and again for another moment brought him back, will not be forgotten by any present. Little remains to be told that has not in it almost unmixed pain and sorrow. Hardly a day passed, while the readings went on or after they closed, unvisited by some effect or other of the disastrous excitement shown by the notes of Mr. Beard. On the 23rd of January, when for the last time he met Carlyle, he came to us with his left hand in a sling. On the 7th of February, when he passed with us his last birthday, and on the 25th, when he read the 3rd number of his novel, the hand was still swollen and painful. And on the 21st of March, when he read admirably his 4th number, he told us that as he came along, walking up the length of Oxford Street, the same incident had recurred as on the day of a former dinner with us, and he had not been able to read, all the way, more than the right hand half of the names over the shops. Yet he had the old fixed persuasion that this was rather the effect of a medicine he had been taking than of any grave cause, and he still strongly believed his other troubles to be exclusively local. 8 days later he wrote, "My uneasiness and hemorrhage, after having quite left me, as I supposed, has come back with an aggravated irritability that it has not yet displayed. You have no idea what a state I am in today from a sudden violent rush of it, and yet it has not the slightest effect on my general health that I know of." This was a disorder which troubled him in his earlier life, and during the last 5 years, in his intervals of suffering from other causes, it had from time to time taken aggravated form. His last public appearances were in April. On the 5th, he took the chair for the news vendors, whom he helped with a genial address in which even his apology for little speaking overflowed with irrepressible humor. He would try, he said, like Falstaff, but with a modification almost as large as himself, less to speak himself than to be the cause of speaking in others. Much in this manner they exhibit at the door of a snuff shop the effigy of a Highlander with an empty mull in his hand, who, apparently having taken all the snuff he can carry, and discharged all the sneezes of which he is capable, politely invites his friends and patrons to step in and try what they can do in the same line. On the 30th of the same month, he returned thanks for literature at the Royal Academy dinner, and I may preface my allusion to what he then said with what he had written to me the day before. 3 days earlier, Daniel Maclise had passed away. Like you at Ely, so I at Higham, had the shock of first reading at a railway station of the death of our old dear friend and companion. What the shock would be, you know too well. It has been only after great difficulty, and after hardening and steeling myself to the subject by at once thinking of it and avoiding it in a strange way, that I have been able to get any command over it or over myself. If I feel at the time that I can be sure of the necessary composure, I shall make a little reference to it at the Academy tomorrow. I suppose you will not be there. The reference made was most touching and manly. He told those who listened that since he first entered the public lists, a very young man indeed, it had been his constant fortune to number among his nearest and dearest friends members of that academy who had been its pride, and who had now, one by one, so dropped from his side that he was grown to believe, with the Spanish monk of whom Wilkie spoke, that the only realities around him were the pictures which he loved, and all the moving life but a shadow and a dream. For many years I was one of the two most intimate friends and most constant companions of Mr. Maclise, to whose death the Prince of Wales has made allusion, and the President has referred with the eloquence of genuine feeling. Of his genius in his chosen art, I will venture to say nothing here. But of his fertility of mind and wealth of intellect, I may confidently assert that they would have made him, if he had been so minded, at least as great a writer as he was a painter. The gentlest and most modest of men, the freshest as to his generous appreciation of young aspirants, and the frankest and largest hearted as to his peers, incapable of a sordid or ignoble thought, gallantly sustaining the true dignity of his vocation, without one grain of self-ambition, wholesomely natural at the last as at the first, in wit a man, simplicity a child, no artist of whatsoever denomination, I make bold to say, ever went to his rest leaving a golden memory more pure from dross, or having devoted himself with a truer chivalry to the art goddess whom he worshipped. These were the last public words of Dickens, and he could not have spoken any worthier. Upon his appearance at the dinner of the Academy had followed some invitations he was led to accept. Greatly to his own regret, he told me on the night 7th of May, when he read to us the 5th number of Edwin Drood, for he was now very eager to get back to the quiet of Gadshill. He dined with Mr. Motley, then American minister, had met Mr. Disraeli at a dinner at Lord Stanhope's, had breakfasted with Mr. Gladstone, and on the 17th was to attend the Queen's ball with his daughter. But she had to go there without him, for on the 16th I had intimation of a sudden disablement. I am sorry to report that, in the old preposterous endeavor to dine at preposterous hours and preposterous places, I have been pulled up by a sharp attack in my foot. And serve me right. I hope to get the better of it soon, but I fear I must not think of dining with you on Friday. I have cancelled everything in the dining way for this week, and that is a very small precaution after the horrible pain I have had and the remedies I have taken. He had to excuse himself also from the general theatrical fund dinner, where the Prince of Wales was to preside. But at another dinner a week later, where the King of the Belgians and the Prince were to be present, so much pressure was put upon him that he went, still suffering as he was, to dine with Lord Houghton. We met for the last time on Sunday, the 22nd of May, when I dined with him in Hyde Park Place. The death of Mr. Lemon, of which he heard that day, had led his thoughts to the crowd of friendly companions in letters and art who had so fallen from the ranks since we played Ben Jonson together that we were left almost alone. And none beyond his 60th year, he said, very few even 50. It is no good to talk of it, I suggested. We shall not think of it the less, was his reply, and an illustration much to the point was before us, afforded by an incident deserving remembrance in his story. Not many weeks before, a correspondent had written to him from Liverpool describing himself as a self-raised man, attributing his prosperous career to what Dickens's writings had taught him at its outset of the wisdom of kindness and sympathy for others, and asking pardon for the liberty he took in hoping that he might be permitted to offer some acknowledgment of what not only had cheered and stimulated him through all his life, but had contributed so much to the success of it. The letter enclosed 500. Dickens was greatly touched by this, and told the writer in sending back his check that he would certainly have taken it if he had not been, though not a man of fortune, a prosperous man himself, but that the letter and the spirit of its offer had so gratified him that if the writer pleased to send him any small memorial of it in another form, he would gladly receive it. The memorial soon came. A richly worked basket of silver, inscribed from one who has been cheered and stimulated by Mr. Dickens's writings, and held the author among his first remembrances when he became prosperous, was accompanied by an extremely handsome silver centerpiece for the table, of which the design was four figures representing the seasons. But the kindly donor shrank from sending winter to one whom he would fain connect with none but the brighter and milder days, and he had struck the fourth figure from the design. I never look at it, said Dickens, that I do not think most of the winter. A matter discussed that day with Mr. Ouvry was briefly resumed in a note of the 29th of May, the last I ever received from him, which followed me to Exeter and closed thus. You and I can speak of it at Gad's by and by. Foot no worse, but no better. The old trouble was upon him when we parted, and this must have been nearly the last note written before he quitted London. He was at Gadshill on the 30th of May, and I heard no more until the telegram reached me at Launceston on the night of the 9th of June, which told me that the by and by was not to come in this world. The few days at Gadshill had been given wholly to work on his novel. He had been easier in his foot and hand, and though he was suffering severely from the local hemorrhage before named, he made no complaint of illness. But there was observed in him a very unusual appearance of fatigue. He seemed very weary. He was out with his dogs for the last time on Monday the 6th of June, when he walked with his letters into Rochester. On Tuesday the 7th, after his daughter Mary had left on a visit to her sister Kate, not finding himself equal to much fatigue, he drove to Cobhamwood with his sister-in-law, there dismissed the carriage, and walked round the park and back. He returned in time to put up in his new conservatory some Chinese lanterns sent from London that afternoon, and, the whole of the evening, he sat with Miss Hogarth in the dining-room that he might see their effect when lighted. More than once he then expressed his satisfaction at having finally abandoned all intention of exchanging Gadshill for London, and this he had done more impressively some days before. While he lived, he said, he should like his name to be more and more associated with the place, and he had a notion that, when he died, he should like to lie in the little graveyard belonging to the cathedral at the foot of the castle wall. On the 8th of June he passed all the day writing in the chalet. He came over for luncheon, and, much against his usual custom, returned to his desk. Of the sentences he was then writing, the last of his long life of literature, a portion has been given in facsimile on a previous page, and the reader will observe with a painful interest, not alone its evidence of minute labor at this fast-closing hour of time with him, but the direction his thoughts had taken. He imagines such a brilliant morning as had risen with that 8th of June shining on the old city of Rochester. He sees in surpassing beauty, with the lusty ivy gleaming in the sun, and the rich trees waving in the balmy air, its antiquities and its ruins, its cathedral and castle. But his fancy, then, is not with the stern dead forms of either, but with that which makes warm the cold stone tombs of centuries, and lights them up with flecks of brightness, fluttering there like wings. To him, on that sunny summer morning, the changes of glorious light from moving boughs, the songs of birds, the scents from garden, woods, and fields, have penetrated into the cathedral, have subdued its earthy odor, and are preaching the resurrection and the life. He was late in leaving the chalet, but before dinner, which was ordered at 6 o'clock with the intention of walking afterwards in the lanes, He wrote some letters, among them one to his friend Mr. Charles Kent, appointing to see him in London next day. And dinner was begun before Miss Hogarth saw, with alarm, a singular expression of trouble and pain in his face. For an hour he then told her he had been very ill, but he wished dinner to go on. These were the only really coherent words uttered by him. They were followed by some that fell from him disconnectedly of quite other matters, of an approaching sale at a neighbor's house, of whether Macready's son was with his father at Cheltenham, and of his own intention to go immediately to London. But at these latter he had risen, and his sister-in-law's help alone prevented him from falling where he stood. Her effort then was to get him on the sofa, but after a slight struggle he sank heavily on his left side. On the ground were the last words he spoke. It was now a little over 10 minutes past 6 o'clock. His two daughters came that night with Mr. Beard, who had also been telegraphed for, and whom they met at the station. His eldest son arrived early next morning, and was joined in the evening too late by his younger son from Cambridge. All possible medical aid had been summoned. The surgeon of the neighborhood was there from the first, and a physician from London was in attendance as well as Mr. Beard. But all human help was unavailing. There was effusion on the brain, and though stertorous breathing continued all night, and until 10 minutes past 6 o'clock on the evening of Thursday, the 9th of June, there had never been a gleam of hope during the 24 hours. He had lived 4 months beyond his 58th year. The excitement and sorrow at his death are within the memory of all. Before the news of it even reached the remoter parts of England, it had been flashed across Europe, was known in the distant continents of India, Australia, and America, and not in English-speaking communities only, but in every country of the civilized earth, had awakened grief and sympathy. In his own land, it was as if a personal bereavement had befallen every one. Her Majesty the Queen telegraphed from Balmoral her deepest regret at the sad news of Charles Dickens's death, and this was the sentiment alike of all classes of her people. There was not an English journal that did not give it touching and noble utterance, and the Times took the lead in suggesting that the only fit resting place for the remains of a man so dear to England was the abbey in which the most illustrious Englishmen are laid. With the expression thus given to a general wish, the Dean of Westminster lost no time in showing ready compliance, and on the morning of the day when it appeared, was in communication with the family and representatives. The public homage of a burial in the abbey had to be reconciled with his own instructions to be privately buried without previous announcement of time or place, and without monument or memorial. Would himself have preferred to lie in the small graveyard under Rochester Castle wall, or in the little churches of Cobham or Shorne? But all these were found to be closed, and the desire of the Dean and Chapter of Rochester to lay him in their cathedral had been entertained, when the Dean of Westminster's request, and the considerate kindness of his generous assurance that there should be only such ceremonial as would strictly obey all injunctions of privacy, made it a grateful duty to accept that offer. The spot already had been chosen by the Dean, and before midday on the following morning, Tuesday the 14th of June, with knowledge of those only who took part in the burial, all was done. The solemnity had not lost by the simplicity. Nothing so grand or so touching could have accompanied it as the stillness and the silence of the vast cathedral. Then, later in the day and all the following day, came unbidden mourners in such crowds that the dean had to request permission to keep open the grave until Thursday. But after it was closed, they did not cease to come, and all day long, Dr. Stanley wrote on the 17th, there was a constant pressure to the spot, and many flowers were strewn upon it by unknown hands, many tears shed from unknown eyes. He alluded to this in the impressive funeral discourse delivered by him in the Abbey on the morning of Sunday the 19th, pointing to the fresh flowers that then had been newly thrown as they still are thrown, in this 4th year after the death, and saying that the spot would thenceforward be a sacred one with both the New World and the Old, as that of the representative of the literature, not of this island only, but of all who speak our English tongue. The stone placed upon it is inscribed. Charles Dickens, born February the 7th, 1812, died June the 9th, 1870. Grave. The highest associations of both the arts he loved surround him where he lies. Next to him is Richard Cumberland. Mrs. Pritchard's monument looks down upon him, and immediately behind is David Garrick's. Nor is the actor's delightful art more worthily represented than the nobler genius of the author. Facing the grave, and on its left and right, are the monuments of Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Dryden, the three immortals who did most to create and settle the language to which Charles Dickens has given another undying name. Venice,